Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Naruto has harem in the Uchiha clan. Before I start, please support for more amazing content and do consider subscribing to my channel and share this video with your friends. This is written by RinneTaicho and link in the description and support writer. Let's start the video. Chapter 1. Witness and Awaken, Magnet and Copy Wheel. Hagakure was considered one of the strongest of the 5 great ninja villages, once the strongest, until the Kikbi attack. 6 years ago the great big kid suddenly appeared in the middle of the village and quickly began to lay waste to the village. Despite the fact that the shinobi of the village including the former Hokage had fought fiercely to force it back, all hope had seemed lost until the 4th Hokage had appeared and transported the beast away. In the end, he gave his life to seal the mighty creature away in a small boy. 3rd Hokage had stepped forward then to once more take the mantle of Hokage. Under his guidance, the village had begun recovering from the devastating episode. For the Kikbi had not left only physical scars on the village, but more invisible ones as well. In the aftermath of the attack, the Uchiha clan had fallen under the suspicions of the higher-ranking members of the village, suspicions that they were involved in the sudden attack causing them to be ostracized from the rest of the Uchiha, endured the mistrust directed at them, however. The leaders of the clan became increasingly angry and unsatisfied at what they viewed as a near-century-long discrimination against them. The final straw came when the Uchiha had been made to live in secluded corner of Konoha, separated from the rest of the village. And thus the road to true conflict began. The ostracized clan began plotting to take the power they thought so rightfully belonged to them. The plot progressed further and further, and the Hokage and elders of the village soon became aware of it. In an attempt to ease the tensions, the 3rd began to try negotiating with the clan, without revealing his knowledge of the plot. The attempts were in vain, as they rebuffed every attempt. That brings us to the beginning of the story, as the tensions begin to approach their apex, and a man was attempting to stop the plot of his clan, only to be intercepted by other forces at work in the village. At the same time, a certain blonde-haired boy was on his way to train for the academy. This boy didn't know that he had the blood of one of Konoha's founding clans flowing through his veins. He also didn't know that that blood would save his life on this day. It was just past midday in Konoha, and the sun shone brightly. A pleasant cool breeze swept through the village. All around, the village was interspersed with lush greenery. The streets bustled with happy inhabitants, unaware of the tension building between the village and one of its most prominent clans. In the area near the training grounds for shinobi, Naruto Uzumaki the Jinchuriki of the Kikbi though, he didn't know that was walking towards his favorite training ground, which was situated along the Naka River. The emerald-colored vegetation was just beginning to show the slightest encroachment of yellow, red, and brown in its vibrant color, showing the gradual change from summer to autumn. The breeze produced a constant rustling sound around the boy. Though he couldn't see it yet, he could hear the quiet rush of water from the Naka River beyond the trees. The sun shone down through the treetops onto his golden blonde hair. Despite how distinctive his hair was, perhaps the most unique thing about him was the 3 whisker marks on each of his cheeks. His clothes were sturdy, the black shirt and tan shorts being perfect for shinobi training. If people who knew him had seen the boy, they would have been surprised by the sad contemplation in his electric blue eyes. Naruto had just begun the academy, and he was on his way to practice his skills after another disappointing day of his instructors being rather reticent about helping him, simply telling him how to do something and then going to help others. Leaving him to figure out anything he didn't understand. The boy couldn't help but wonder why everyone treated him like that, like they didn't want him around. It had been that way since his memory began just a few short years ago. The small blonde's expression became downtrodden. He thought of the way people treated him and how it was made worse by the fact he was an orphan. He had no idea who his parents were or if they were dead or abandoned him. Did they too dislike him like so many others did? Had they abandoned him because they couldn't stand him? He wanted a family more than anything, someone to care about him like all the other kids seemed to have. Every time someone had come to adopt a kid at the orphanage, he had always felt hope they would pick him. But they didn't. People would just give him a cold look like everyone else and then pick another child. Finally, it got to a point where he had begged the old man to let him live in his own apartment so he didn't have to deal with the constant disappointment. He cheered up slightly, thinking of the elderly Hokage. The 3rd was one of the few people he knew that was kind to him and the Ichirakus from his favorite restaurant. They were the things that made life bearable for him, especially the 3rd, who he called Gramps, and he really was like a grandfather to him, always helping him out and making sure he was doing okay, sharing his wisdom with him and telling him cool stories about his experience as a ninja. Despite this bond, he wanted to find out who his parents were one day, so he at least knew where he came from. Even if it turned out they hadn't loved him. Until then, he would just train to be the most baddest ninja he could. More specifically, he wanted to be Hokage, like his Gramps and his idol the 4th. He wanted to be as cool and powerful as them, maybe then the villagers would start to acknowledge him instead of ignoring him. But significantly more positive thoughts, the blonde turned his mind back to what the task at hand, going to train. It was with a start that he realized, during his inner musing, he had just about reached the edge of the clearing he was heading for. He had just reached the bushes when he heard two strange noises. The first was rather simple to discern and not too strange considering where he was. The clang of metal on metal was something that could almost always be found in a training ground. It was the second sound, a strange hiss that got his attention. It was very loud, easily reaching him. The curious boy walked to the edge of the vegetation to look through the bushes at the cause of the noise. His curiosity quickly became shock when he beheld the scene in the clearing. On the riverbank before him, he saw a completely unexpected sight. There were 7 people locked in mortal combat. And it wasn't the kind that you engaged in for training. There were far too many killing blows being attempted. That wasn't even mentioning the one combatant that looked to be badly injured. 6 of the 7 appeared to be Anbu, but something was off. They wore the typical Anbu mask and cloak, but underneath that the uniforms seemed to vary greatly, and not one seemed to wear the actual Anbu vest and shoulder-length gloves or grey arm guards. What's more, they were attacking the 7th man, throwing ninja tools, as well as the occasional water jutsu at him, waves and bullets launching at him, attempting to slam into him. In response, the man would launch back large gouts of fire, so hot Naruto could feel a slight heat from where he stood in the bushes, turning the attacks into steam, the source of the constant hiss he had heard. The 7th man, the one launching fire, was the most interesting. He wore typical attire from the Uchiha clan that he often saw around the village, with a dark high-collar shirt and dark ninja pants, as well as what seemed to be a holster for his tanto, which he used to fend off the weapons, while seemingly appearing and disappearing to dodge the jutsu and move faster. The man had unruly black hair and a broad nose. The most interesting thing was his right eye, which was crimson, with a black shuriken in the center. His left eye, however, was closed. Naruto could see crimson trail of blood streak down his face from that eye. It was clear that the 6 men were trying to kill the fire-breathing man. He already had several small cuts that looked to be caused by the tanto the supposed Anbu carried, and even a rather serious laceration on his right side that looked very wide and deep. Almost as if whatever had cut him had glided through him like a knife through butter, skin, muscle, bone, everything. Naruto began to feel a pit of fear grow in his stomach like a lead weight. One thing he knew from his conversations with his surrogate grandfather, the third, was that his Anbu always wore the standard uniform unless on infiltration missions, where they dressed as regular civilians. If these 6 men were dressed as neither, it meant they were not the Hokage's Anbu, or possibly not Anbu at all. One thing was clear, they were attacking a Konoha shinobi, and if they were willing to do that, they would have no issue silencing him. He wasn't stupid. If they went to the trouble of hiding their faces, they didn't want their activities known. They would kill him to stop him from telling anyone. Reality struck him in the face like a warhammer. He needed to get out of there, now. So great was his shock and fear, he didn't pay close enough attention to his surroundings. He began to retreat without taking his eyes off the clearing. Something he would regret. Naruto took a step back, instantly freezing when a deafening crack rent the air like a gunshot. He looked in terror at the broken branch beneath his foot. The young boy shivered in fear, he didn't want to look up. He could feel the eyes in the clearing turning to him. Against his better judgment, he did, and instantly regretted it. He witnessed the gazes of the false Anbu turning to him in a creepy sort of synchronization. The blonde felt a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. A wave of fear enveloped him. His veins were flooded with adrenaline, and he broke out in a cold sweat. At that moment, the small boy did the only thing he could think of, he turned and ran away from the creepy masked men as fast as he could. Eliminate him, there are to be no witnesses. The monotone voice in the sent a shiver up Naruto's spine. There was zero emotion in the man's voice. Without needing any prompts, the 3 figures, one wearing a dog mask with 4 eyes, one a demon mask, and the other a regular cat mask, took off in the direction of the panicked academy student, intent on eliminating him. Naruto dashed madly through the forest, not really paying attention to where he was going. He tore through the bushes in a frenzy, his heart threatening to burst from his chest, as from Er's extremely high rate from the combination of fear and exercise. The greenery passed by in a blur. All he wanted to do was put as much distance as possible between himself and the masked men. His heart was pounding so hard the beats reverberated throughout his entire chest, and the blood rushed through his veins so fast he could actually hear it pounding in his ears. That was why he barely heard the rustle of leaves behind him. Still, he heard it and looked back to find out what it was. He almost wished he hadn't. 3 of the fake Anbu were chasing after him, easily dashing through the thick vegetation around the training ground. The most scary part was the methodical pace they kept, never really trying to close the distance between them and himself. Their masks didn't help any either. While the cat-masked one on the left was normal enough, the one in the middle, the four-eyed dog, and the one on the right, a demon with tusks jutting from its lower lip, were very abnormal. They were like twisted versions of the regular Anbu masks. The supposed Anbu never stepped up the pace, seemingly content to keep following him, something that surprised the blonde. Why aren't they trying to catch me? Aren't they worried I'll get away? It made him increasingly worried. They didn't seem like the types to make a bunch of mistakes, so that meant there was some reason they weren't worried about his escape. He had just reached that last conclusion when the blonde shot out of the bushes and came to a skidding stop, and his stomach seemed to suddenly drop. The little Jinchuriki had discovered why they hadn't bothered to pick up the pace. They obviously knew the terrain better. He was currently standing on a rocky bank next to the Naka River. Water thundered over the cliffside to churn the waters of the river bellow into a white foam. He stared in shock and despair at the cliff before him. Beside him the river flowed by, and a roar filled the air, along with a fine mist created by the thousands of gallons of falling water. With a sinking heart, Naruto turned around, backing up to the edge of the light gray rocky bank, right up until he felt the light mist on his calves from the river flowing rapidly by. He saw the three masked men methodically walking towards him. In that moment, he was certain they were there to kill him. He just knew they didn't have good intentions towards him, and it terrified him because he knew he couldn't take a single one of them. The Anbu lookalikes seemed to pause in their approach, simply standing there looking at him, the unmoving faces of their masks being very creepy to the 7-year-old boy. Finally, the lead man, the one with the dog mask, spoke. In the relative silence that filled the air, save the sounds occasional of bird calls and the sound of the waterfall, the man whispered his orders to the two flanking him. "See to incapacitate him by any means. The boy only has to live long enough for us to get him to Lord Danzum to extract the beast. It matters not what happens after that." Naruto tensed. He couldn't make out what was said, the constant roaring of the waterfall filled his ears, blocking out nearly all other sound. Soon as the order was given, the trio began to approach once more, increasing the anxiousness and worries of the blonde. Naruto could tell he had this feeling in his gut that he couldn't shake. He simply knew they were going to kill him. The boy gulped audibly before trying to reason with them to get them to spare him. Even if it was futile. "DP, please, don't kill me. I won't tell anyone what I saw." Naruto stuttered in fear, not wanting to die. There were so many things he wanted to do. Get the acknowledgement of the people of Konoha, become Hokage, find out who his family was. For a moment, the three paused, and he felt a slight hope that maybe they would spare him. That hope was dashed the next moment when the lead man spoke. "That is not possible. Lord Danzum's orders were clear, there are to be no witnesses to our involvement. Do not struggle, and it will be over quick," the dog-masked one said in a monotone voice. As soon as the man finished his sentence, Naruto's heart sank and he felt as if his stomach had dropped past his knees. His throat constricted, he couldn't breathe or speak, he could only watch them draw the tip-less tanto they seemed to have in common. In his chest, his heart began beating wildly. Adrenaline flooded his veins, causing his arms to go tingly numb. The dog-masked man shot forward at tremendous speeds to Naruto at least, beginning to raise his tanto to strike Naruto. The man got closer and closer, and Naruto's perception of the world seemed to slow down to a crawl as his eyes widened in unadulterated fear. All the surrounding sounds faded away into a vacuum of silence where only his heartbeat could be heard, thumping loudly in his chest. Bum. The man raised his tanto extremely slowly. Bum. The man reached Naruto, began bringing his tanto down. Bum. Naruto felt his eyes involuntarily close. The tanto began to descend upon him. Bum. Just when the tanto was about to reach his neck, Naruto's eyes snapped open, glaring at his attacker with eyes that were startlingly different from their previous sparkling blue. Instead, bloody red orbs glared menacingly at the masked man, with a single black tama mark spinning around each pupil. At the exact same moment, the tanto suddenly halted in midair, as if being held by an invisible hand. Try as he might, he couldn't move it to strike the blonde. The seconds went by, and a slight rustling began in the man's equipment pouches. All the while he looked into the red eyes of the blonde. "Sharingan," he muttered questioningly to himself. Naruto didn't hear it in his trance. Not knowing of the occurrence and simply seeing their partner's blades stopped, the other two moved to strike him as well. As soon as their blades came within an inch of the blonde, they too stopped suddenly. When they did, the dog-masked one felt the tug in his pouches become even more pronounced, and his fellow felt it begin for them. All at once, the sound of tearing cloth rent the air, echoing throughout the clearing. From the equipment pouches of the three masked men, dozens of black blurs shot forth, all towards the three tantos of the men, leaving cuts in their clothes and on their skin as they took the most direct route to the tip-less steel blades, leaving small trickles of crimson liquid leaking down their skin. The black blurs met the unique tantos in a tremendous ching-clang of metal on metal, echoing loudly across the water and even down to the area at the bottom of the waterfall. When the momentum of the blurs was stopped by the tantos, it was revealed that the blurs were in fact every single kunai and shuriken on them, with each man having at least a couple dozen of each clinging to their tantos and each other, making them look like spiky clubs of black metal. Despite the unexpected result, there was no reaction of shock or surprise from the false Anbu. The metal has become magnetized. That is why the blade stopped moving, and similar pull as the tanto, while the shuriken have the opposite pull. Said the demon-masked one. Indeed, perhaps magnet release. Lord Dansm will surely be interested in this child, with both the Sharingan and magnet style. The cat-masked one added, receiving a nod from the others. It seems that non-lethal force will be required. The apparent leader commented. Just as well, metal weapons will be useless against the boy. He concluded. While the three were discerning what had happened, Naruto had entered a trance-like state. His eyes glassed over, and his face went completely blank. Just when the masked individuals finished their deductions, Naruto's right arm rose from his side in a manner eerily similar to that of a zombie, but without the groaning and decomposing flesh. The last thing the three Anbu lookalike saw was him clenching his hand, before all they could see was black and silver slivers. The slivers attacked ferociously, leaving hundreds if not thousands of paper-thin cuts on the men. It was so painful, it even made the emotionally void root members who had been trained to have a pain tolerance even greater than the already impressive level of most ninja let loose screams of agony. Blood sprayed through the air from numerous cuts across their bodies, the heavy scent of iron filling the air as the crimson life-giving liquid splashed on the ground and all over Naruto's front. Their clothes were reduced to tatters, the men looked more like lumps of raw meat than humans. It was when the first warm spray of liquid hit his face that Naruto came out of his trance. He looked in shock as he was showered in the blood of the three men who were now unrecognizable. For a moment, he was frozen in shock. He watched the bodies fall and felt himself covered in the thick warm crimson blood. Finally, the adrenaline began to leave and his heart slowed down. He felt fatigue weighing him down, his limbs feeling like lead and his eyelids drooping. Even in the exhausted fog, he managed to whisper a shocked question, did I do that, did I kill them? His eyelids began to feel like lead and started to close. The crimson hue that had taken them over receded and his normal electric blue color returned for a moment. Then his eyes closed. His body gave way to the fatigue. Slowly, he began to tip backwards, splashing down into the swift current just as he lost consciousness. The young boy didn't even register the freezing shock of the cold water embracing him. Upon hitting the water, his body sunk, slightly at first, but then bubbles erupting around it and water was thrown into the air, sparkling in the sunlight. He submerged for a moment and then his body gently floated to the surface. With a low bloop the boy surfaced and ripples spread outwards from where he had landed. His wet hair was now sticking to his forehead and his soaking clothes slightly weighed him down, barely keeping his face above the water. Soon though, his body began to be pulled towards the edge of the waterfall like a bug stuck in the water as a bathtub drains. At first his clothes slowed him down slightly, but as he got closer and closer to the edge, his speed and momentum increased, drawing him faster and faster towards his certain demise by being dashed upon the rocks at the bottom of the large waterfall. His clothes doing less and less to slow him. Finally he was pitched over the side of the fall at high speeds, spiraling down through the air end over end. His soaking clothes and wet hair were pulled back tight to his body, flapping loudly behind him from the force of his fall. He was getting closer and closer to being splattered upon the rocks and water below, nothing but a stain on the surface. It began to look hopeless as he approached midway down. He would be dashed upon the surface below, never awakening, never reaching his dreams or goals. Nobody would ever know what became of him. It was then, as he reached midway, that a black and white blur seemed to flash across the waterfall, snatching him from midair and carrying him to a tree branch on the side of the cliff. Once it had stopped, the blur was revealed to be an extremely old man holding Naruto gently in his arms. He was definitely very old, older even than the third, and emaciated. His pale, wrinkly skin stretched over a body that was undoubtedly once toned and athletic, still possessing wiry muscle even as it had aged. His hair was very long, thin, and spiky, reaching his waist with a bang covering his right eye. He wore a simple black robe and simple straw sandals with waraji. Onyx eyes gazed down at the blonde intensely for a moment. The man examined him, as if searching for something in his features. He seemed to find it and his eyes softened, a warm look entering the black pools. The man then whispered to the unconscious blonde. So I was correct. It is you, my grandson. It would seem you have inherited my unfortunate habit of getting into complicated situations. The old man whispered to himself and the blonde before he disappeared in a swirl of leaves. Behind the curtain of white that was the waterfall along the Naka River, the mist from the cascading current was flung into the air. A constant roar filled the air in front of the rocky entrance. The waters from the upper portion of the river thundered down into the lower portion of the river. The waters at the entrance were churned into a constant white foam that floated downwards and slowly dissipated in the crystal blue current. Beyond that majestic curtain lay the entrance to a cave. And beyond that lay a long tunnel that led back underneath the river. Even further beyond this, the tunnel led into a fairly large rocky cavern lit by torches along the walls that gave the otherwise dark place a soft light. On one side, there was another waterfall, considerably smaller than the one outside, that fed into a large clear cool pool of water with a traditional wooden bridge arching over it. Along the floor, interspersed here and there, were stalagmites pointing proud and tall into the air. Perhaps the most prominent landmark was the Japanese-style wooden house at the back of the cave. The front doors were a sliding style of door, and inside those doors, in the front room of the house, the cave's only occupant sat in a meditative pose, extending his senses around him. The occupant was a very old man, almost emaciated in appearance, with many wrinkles. His hair was slightly thin, long, and spiky, with one bang covering his right eye, and he wore a simple black robe. His name was Madara Uchiha, the former head of the Uchiha clan, and considered by many to be one of the worst traders in Konoha's entire history. He was doing an exercise to maintain his sensing abilities, extending them around him to try and sense any signatures near him, or even far away. It was one of the few things he could do to keep his chakra skills sharp. It was as he was doing this that he sensed something peculiar. 7 signatures doing battle along the Naka River. 6 of them chased after the 7th, throwing jutsu at the person. All of the individuals had at least Anbu level reserves if he was sensing right, and one seemed to be an Uchiha, as he could sense the special chakra of the Sharingan being used. That was the one that was being attacked. Curious. But that wasn't all. Very near to them, and getting closer, seemed to be a signature slightly larger than those. After a moment the 8th signature suddenly began moving fastly in his direction, and 3 of the other signatures chasing the 7th broke off and began chasing the 8th. While they ran, the person's chakra seemed to be fluctuating, as if something was happening to them. Could it be a bloodline stirring? Curious. The chase lasted for a few minutes, until the 8th person was backed up against the river almost directly above him. It was as this happened that whatever bloodline that had begun stirring finally awakened in the 8th person, and Madara's eyes opened in shock. There wasn't one bloodline awakening, but 2. And he recognized them both. Cold fingers seemed to be trailing down his spine, and a pit of worry formed in his stomach as he recognized not only the chakra distinctive of the Sharingan, but another bloodline that was all too familiar. One he hadn't felt in years. Only one word passed through his mind as his features hardened. Naruto, he thought, before he vanished in a blur of motion. Brip. 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 Naruto's eyes scrunched up at the noise that invaded his ears, of water dripping down onto another watery surface. He felt tired, he didn't want to get up. Brip. Brip. The noise continued, and his mind began to become more awake. The events that led to his unconsciousness came rushing back to him in rapid succession. His eyes snapped wide open in shock and fear, and he sat up abruptly, looking wildly around himself. The blonde couldn't help but be confused by his surroundings. He lay in the middle of a corridor that looked like the basement of an industrial plant, with metal pipes running along the walls and ceiling. The floor was flooded with a pool of water maybe a couple inches deep, but strangely enough, he didn't feel his clothes were wet or any dampness on his skin. The entire place seemed to be illuminated by a low golden light, leaving plenty of shadows dancing around him and causing it to have an ethereal air to it. Slowly he began to get up on his feet, taking in more of the strange place, trying to get a clue as to where he was. The first thing he noticed was the fact that the air strangely enough wasn't stale like you would expect for the underground. From what he could tell, the corridor carried on for quite a ways, extending into the shadows. With nothing else to do, the boy began to walk down the hallway, hoping to find a way out this strange place. The blonde soon came to the end of the corridor, coming to a crossroads from another corridor. It was here that he came across his first significant finding in this strange place, as he saw a bright light sparkling in the distance. That's when he began to hear it, the faint whisper of a rumbling, deep, gravelly voice. It emanated from the faint light at the end of the corridor. The voice beckoned. Naruto was immediately on guard. The voice filled him with dread, a cold pit forming in his stomach. It sounded primal and ancient. Who's there? Where am I? Naruto called into the darkness of the corridor. Come to me. The voice called once more. Reluctantly, Naruto found himself continuing to walk down the corridor towards where the voice came from. Whatever it was knew he was here, so there was no point trying to hide or run. He became aware of a new noise entering his range of hearing. At first, he mistook it for the sound of wind passing through the corridor. Boo-whoosh. 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 On the sound went. Finally, he recognized it for what it was when he got far enough along the corridor. It was the sound of a giant pair of lungs pumping air in and out. A shiver of fear ran down his spine. How large did a creature have to be to produce such a noise simply by breathing? He wasn't sure he wanted to find out. Still, the blonde continued to walk through the corridor, noting that for some reason, his vision seemed much better than it usually was. He could see almost every detail of the corridor, even in the dark. Had he been able to see himself, he would have seen that his eyes glowed a bloody red in the darkness, one tomo adjacent to the pupil in each eye. He began to see a glow at the end of the corridor. Whatever lay beyond was significantly brighter than the corridor. It took him but moments to reach the end of the tunnel, and he was blinded briefly by the bright light, white spots blurring his vision and obscuring the room for a moment. Blinking furiously, the white spots began to disappear slowly from his vision, allowing him to view the room he was in. He was in a rather large room, with pipes all along the walls, and if he guessed right, most likely the ceiling, which couldn't be seen because it was so high up shadows obscured it. The object that held the blonde's attention the most though, was the giant golden gates that stood imposingly from floor to ceiling directly across from him, with a border around them with golden spiral designs. There appeared to be a large piece of paper, almost as big as his body, holding it shut, with the kanji for seal on it. Even with his strangely enhanced vision, he couldn't see what was inside. It was simply a sea of darkness, like no light could exist within it. The most disconcerting part was that he could tell the deep breaths were coming from within that vast darkness. He felt a wave of malice and hatred crash down upon him when he began to cross the room. The wave forced him to his knees, with his eyes bulging wide in fear. He couldn't stand, he couldn't talk, he could barely even breathe. It was 10 times worse than when he had felt the terror when he was about to be killed by the 3 masked men. The blonde felt himself breaking out in a cold sweat. The pressure increased to the point he couldn't even draw a breath. He soon found himself struggling to stay conscious, black spots beginning to invade his vision. Finally, mercifully, the pressure lifted from him. A deep rumbling chuckle filled the room. Naruto collapsed forward onto his hands and knees, panting with eyes still wide in shock and fear. Suddenly, that same voice from before boomed out to him. So my warden has finally come before me. The voice called out. The visibly shaken Naruto got to his feet slowly. He looked directly into the darkness. Right now he stood just a short distance away from the cage. All he wanted to do was turn and flee in terror. The boy shook his head. He attempted to rein in his fear, managing to shift his facial features from being terrified with wide eyes to simply one of wariness. Who are you? He asked cautiously. In response, he received another deep chuckle before something terrifying happened. In the dark abyss inside the cage, 2 enormous crimson eyes with slit pupils shot open, with a huge gleaming white grin soon following, the large pointed teeth as big as Naruto himself. Naruto took a step back in fear at the bloodthirsty grin and the almost manic glaring eyes, just as an reddish-orange paw that resembled a human-like hand shot forward towards him, gleaming white claws looking to impale him. The boy saw it coming in slow motion and threw himself backwards, landing on his rear in the pool of water on the floor. Still, the claws continued to come towards him and were just about to impale him when. Clang. With a resounding crash, the paw was stopped as it crashed against the bars of the cage, stopping one of the claws just inches from Naruto's face. If the blonde hadn't thrown himself backwards, he would have been impaled on the claw. Looking up at the owner of the paw with eyes wide in shock, Naruto gulped in fear as he saw a vision of terror. The shadows in the cage crawled backwards to reveal a beast of nightmares. Standing there looking at him with a menacing grin and one paw attempting to impale him was a giant reddish-orange fox with a human-like torso and rabbit-like ears, with black marks extending from its eyes into the inside of its ears. Behind it waved 9 giant tails that seemed to have a mind of their own. He was standing in front of the Kikbi no Imko. The greatest calamity to ever befall Konoha. Of course, it's just my luck that you two have an ability that will help you control me. To think you are from that accursed clan. The fox growled. For his part, Naruto was frozen in shock and fear, it felt like someone had poured ice water into his veins. It took several moments for him to register what the fox said and formulate a reply. Why you're the Kikbi? Where are we and what's this about control and a clan? Naruto asked, shaky at first, but stronger and more confused at the end. In response, the Kikbi removed its claw from the cage door, laying down and growling at the boy. Don't play dumb with me boy, you are undoubtedly a member of those accursed uchiha. With that repugnant Sharingan. Kikbi bellowed. The blonde was frozen in shock. He tried to process the Kikbi's words, but they were just too absurd. Still in denial, he looked down into the pool of water at his feet, only to see his reflection staring back at him, his eyes a glowing bloody crimson, with a single black tomo spinning around the pupil in each eye. The Sharingan, but how? Naruto whispered to himself in complete shock. Madara Uchiha had lived a very long life. He had lived longer than even the 3rd Hokage or 3rd Tsuchikage had. Over that time, he had seen and done many things, many of which he was not proud of. Twice, he had fallen into the curse of hatred that plagued his clan, twice he had turned his back on his best friend, a man who believed in him when nobody else did, and thrown their friendship away. And twice he had been pulled from that hatred, once by his friend and once by the woman he loved. He had fought in endless battles, founded alongside Hashirama the first ever hidden village, where ninja clans that previously would have been at war could live together in peace, turned his back on that village to pursue a mad plan to bring a world where no one had to be a loser. Looking upon the sleeping face of his grandson reminding him so much of his son, he felt the weight of his years pressing on him more than ever. They were currently in a rather simple room with wood paneling on the walls, ceiling, and floor. A simple bed with a wooden frame stood in the corner, and a chandelier filled with candles hung from the ceiling, bathing the room in a warm yellow light. Naruto was tucked under the covers, still unconscious from his ordeal, and Madara suspected interacting with the Kyuubi. In the ancient Uchiha's opinion, that was a good thing, because the sooner he got to know the fox, the sooner he could learn to use its power. Looking at his grandson, Madara felt the warm content feeling of love suffusing his being, a feeling he hadn't felt since he had lived happily with his wife and son before she died and his son went missing. His grandson was now the only family he had, and because of his foolish hatred, he was in danger, and it was up to the elderly Uchiha to prepare him to face it when it came. But right now, there were things he needed to do. With a weary sigh, the Uchiha turned and began to walk out of the room. I had best dispose of what's left of the bodies before anyone finds them. The blonde Uzumaki stared into the water below him, and more specifically at the pair of bloody vermilion eyes staring back at him. His eyes were wide in astonishment, and he could feel his body shaking. Such was the shock of seeing the famous Dojutsu of the Uchiha clan in his eyes. Naruto had seen Uchiha clan members around the village, he'd even seen the Sharingan before. But he had never expected to see it in his own eyes. How was it possible? He had thought he was just an orphan, some kid that everyone seemed to hate for a reason he couldn't grasp. How's this possible? I'm no Uchiha. Naruto asked, stated to himself in shock, something the Kyuubi heard. The beast couldn't withhold a snort of derision, the noise echoing off the walls. Obviously you are, little boy. There's no doubt that is the Sharingan. The Kyuubi growled, causing Naruto to look up at it more. It snarled in fury when Naruto met its eyes. Turn those infernal things off before I find a way to rip them from your skull and make jam from them to spread on crackers. The fox snarled in annoyance, its tails whipping about in agitation. Naruto gulped in fear. How do I do that? He asked nervously, not wanting to upset it. Lucky for him, the fox simply gave a derisive growl before answering. You certainly don't act like most of your clan. To turn those stupid things off, you need to stop the chakra flowing in your eyes, whelp. It replied in a huff. Still slightly confused, Naruto struggled to control his chakra, willing the chakra in his eyes to halt. He found it difficult. Out of all of the students in his class, he was the worst at chakra control. It was with much relief that he looked down into the water to see his normal blue eyes looking back at him. Shakily, he looked back up at the Kyuubi, still having questions for the ancient entity. Like where the heck they were and what the beast was doing there. For a few minutes, everything was silent until he finally worked up the nerve to speak to the being once more, choosing his words carefully so as not to upset it. I don't want to be disrespectful, but where are we? And what did you mean when you called me your warden? More importantly, how are you here? All the stories say the fourth killed you. Naruto asked cautiously. As soon as the last sentence left his mouth, Naruto knew he touched a nerve. Instantly the fox once more tried to impale him, slamming its hand-like paw into the bars again. It snarled in fury, trying in vain to get to the blonde. Kill me? The great Kyuubi no Ilko killed by a lowly human. Kyuubi roared in fury, causing the boy to cower slightly from the sheer might of its rage. Even though the fourth was his hero, he daren't try to talk back to the chakra being. After a moment, the fox seemed to regain its composure, but with the malicious snarl still in place. When next it spoke, it was much calmer, with a touch of arrogance. Please, that whelp barely managed to seal me away with the help of that pathetic woman. The mere notion of him being able to kill me is laughable. The fox told him. As opposed to the previous statements, this one drew curiosity from the blonde. What did it mean, a woman? All the stories he heard said the fourth beat the Kyuubi alone. And what was this business about sealing? He didn't know much about sealing, only what the third had told him, but if the Kyuubi was sealed in something, there was no way he should be able to be face to face with it. If you're sealed away, how can I be talking to you? How'd I get in a seal? He asked. To his surprise, the chakra entity seemed to find this amusing. Its dark chuckles filled the boiler room as it replied with a malicious smirk. Foolish little boy. I called you my warden, are you too stupid to realize what those two things mean? The fox taunted. The reason you are my warden, and the reason you can be the very reason you are shunned by the people of your village is because your beloved fourth sealed me inside of you. Said Kyuubi with a twisted grin. It seemed that the fox took a twisted glee in its container's pain. Naruto's eyes widened in shock as the booming echoes of the Kyuubi's hate-filled mirth reverberated through the room and through his body. It made horrifying sense. The reason everyone ignored him or glared at him. Why when he would describe people that were particularly mean to him to his grandfather figure, they would disappear. All because he had the Kyuubi sealed in him the day he was born, by his hero no less. It took him several minutes to recover his faculties. He struggled to come to terms with all the life-altering occurrences he had recently experienced. He had learned he had the Sharingan, made his first kill, and learned he was the jailer to a massive chakra monster, all in one day. It was surprising he wasn't exhausted, but since it was his mind, it was slightly understandable. Naruto gazed at the reflection of himself in the water, he became curious. Once more he allowed chakra into his eyes. It was fascinating to see the normally electric blue eyes bleed into crimson red, the black tomo spinning slowly. Before he could get too into looking at his new eyes, he found himself interrupted by a deep growl from the occupant of the cage. "Why are you playing with those, boy? I told you to keep them off." It growled in annoyance. Instead of being cowed as he was earlier, the blonde decided to keep them on, something that seemed to annoy the fox, as the boy decided to look at him with them. "I have them now, so I might as well get used to them. Gramps says there's nothing more foolish than wielding a weapon you don't know how to use," he replied. Naruto was beginning to get curious as to why the fox seemed to loathe the eyes. "Why do you hate the Sharingan so much?" Naruto asked in a respectful tone, trying to not upset the entity. It was locked in a cage, but Naruto didn't want to press his luck and make the Kyuubi angry. At first it seemed like the fox would refuse to answer as the silence stretched for near a minute. Finally, it was broken with an resigned huff from the monster. "Those filthy monkey eyes have been used to control me twice by members of your damned clan," it answered. This was something Naruto found interesting. It explained what it had meant when it had said he had an ability with the potential to control it. He was going to question it further, but it seemed the fox was now feeling talkative, continuing without the need of prodding. "It makes my blood boil seeing you looking at me with them. They remind me of that man." The fox growled, it narrowed its eyes, focusing harder on the blonde. "In fact, if you had black hair, you would be the spitting image of him if he was a boy," it said with a menacing snarl. Naruto didn't know what to make of that. He reminded the Kyuubi of one of the men that had controlled it. But who could that be? "Udi," he began, halting as he began feeling a strange sensation. It felt like he was being pulled from his spot, yet not in any direction. His form began fading. Naruto looked around himself in worry. "What's happening?" he asked in a panicked tone. Seeing the panic, the fox snorted in amusement, resting its head in its palm in a bored fashion. "Oh, settle down, foolish boy. Your body is simply awakening from its forced nap after you butchered those 3 men. I must say, it was a most impressive display for one so small." The fox chuckled, seeming to find amusement in the way the 3 men had died. Naruto froze as he was reminded of his recent kills, slowly fading from the seal with a shocked look. "Ugh," Naruto groaned loudly from his prone position in the bed. Wait, bed. Last thing he knew, he was falling into a river. With a jolt, his eyes snapped wide and he sat up from his position, throwing the covers off the upper part of his body as he did so. Many questions filled his mind. How did he get here? Where was here? His head turned from side to side as if it was on a swivel. Eyes blazing with the Sharingan, he caught every detail of the room around him. The searching stopped when his gaze landed on a very old man sitting next to the bed he laid in, looking at him with amusement. "It would seem you took quite the fall, my boy. If I hadn't arrived in time, you would undoubtedly be dead," the man said, a glint of something Naruto couldn't quite place flashing through his eyes. Before Naruto could even think to reply, he winced as he suddenly heard the voice of the Kyuubi roaring loudly inside his head. "Madara, let me out so I can kill him." The outburst caused a headache for Naruto. He could practically see the Kyuubi slamming itself against its cage, trying to get out to get this man it apparently knew. Surprisingly, it seemed the man seemed to be aware of this. "Ah, I suppose the Kyuubi is giving you trouble. Understandable, considering our history." That was it, who the hell was this Madara guy? The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. He was almost certain that his Gramps had mentioned it in one of his stories. "Who the hell are you? Why does the Kyuubi want to get you so bad? How do you even know about it? And where the heck are we?" Naruto asked in slightly irritated tone. It seemed like the entire day he had been out of the know. First, he planned on going to train, only to have people try to kill him. Then he had fallen into a river and gone unconscious, meeting the Kyuubi and learning he was not only the apparent Jinchuriki of said beast, but that he possessed the Sharingan. Finally, he now woke up and found himself in an unknown place, with an unknown man that the Kyuubi seemed to hate sitting near him. Needless to say, he was tired of the word unknown. The man seemed to consider his question, his expression becoming much more serious. Well, in reverse order. We are in a hidden base of mine behind the waterfall you fell over. The Kikbi hates me because I am one of only 2 men to control it with a Sharingan, and, as to who I am," he said, pausing as he closed his eyes, allowing Naruto's own to widen in shock, the Sharingan still spinning. This was one of the men that had controlled the Kikbi. Was he the one that Kikbi said he reminded him of? After a moment, the man's eyes snapped open, a fully matured Sharingan spinning to life in his eyes as he looked at Naruto. "I am Madara Uchiha, and I am your grandfather." Chapter end. Chapter 2. The Tale of Madara and Shisui's Gift. The blonde Uchiha stared with shocked Sharingan eyes at the old man in front of him. His body was frozen in shock at the bombshell Madara had just hit him with, the breath seemed to be driven from his body, like someone just hit him in the stomach with a sledgehammer. Did he just hear him right? Did the old man just claim to be his grandfather? It seemed completely ridiculous. After all, what were the chances that he would fall off a waterfall that his long-lost grandfather lived behind? Things like that just didn't happen. The claim was plain ludicrous. But there was one thing that made his claim believable. The Sharingan. Naruto couldn't help but remember how the Kikbi said he reminded it of one of the men that controlled it, that he looked like him. Could it really be true? Could he really be my grandfather? Thought Naruto to himself uncertainly. If it was true, Naruto had a lot of questions for the man. First and foremost being where he had been his entire life. Still slightly skeptical, Naruto decided to at least see what he had to say. The man did save him from falling to his death after all. "I'm not saying I believe you, but say it is true that you are my grandfather. Where have you been all my life?" asked Naruto cautiously, deactivating his Sharingan to stop the drain on his chakra. The elder Uchiha sighed at his question, looking much older than his already very advanced age. The white-haired man looked down, his onyx eyes vacant as he became engrossed in his inner thoughts. "I can assure you, I am your grandfather," said Madara. "As for where I have been all your life, that is a long story and one full of many mistakes I have regretted." Naruto simply looked at him with his eyes full of determination. Clearly he wouldn't be giving up until he had answers. "Very well. To understand the reason I have not been there, you must first know the story of my life after I left Konoha nearly 40 years ago, on the day I met your grandmother in the deserts of the Land of Wind," began Madara, his mind becoming lost in the past 45 years ago. 39 years ago. Madara's feet padded softly across the desert. He wore a black cloak over his usual armor which produced a constant clanking sound, with a hood up to cast a shadow over his eyes, and his war fan strapped to his back. Around him a howling wind whipped up the sands of the desert, creating an opaque cloud that blocked off visibility just a few meters in front of him. But he paid no heed to it or the sand that rubbed against his skin, scrubbing it raw. It had been 23 years since his fight with Hashirama at the place that had afterwards been dubbed the Valley of the End. Since then, he had spent his time making preparations for the Eye of the Moon plan. After awakening the Rinnegan, he had summoned the statue he had dubbed the Jito statue and created a clone of Hashirama, along with a strange type of creature that grew from the same tree as the clone that called themselves Zetsu. The sound of his cloak flapping around filled his ears as he made his way across the deserts of the Land of Wind. He was here to scout Sunagakure, the village that possessed the Ichibi no Shukaku. Before he began collecting the Bijk, he had to plan out every little detail, like where he would extract them, which would require he find places to serve as temporary bases in all the nations that had Jinchuriki. His first stop was naturally the village who not only had the weakest Bijk but was probably the weakest of the Great Five in military strength. For half the day he walked, heedless of the heat beating down on his neck or the wind that carried sand with it, rubbing his skin raw. He simply carried onward at a steady pace. It wasn't until he was only a few hours from the walls of Suna that anything out of the ordinary happened. Through his sensing skills, he sensed a rather impressive chakra signature nowhere near his or Hashirama's, but definitely impressive. It even had an especially unique feel, like the person possessed a bloodline, one he hadn't encountered before. Whoever it was, they were headed towards Suna from the border with a Shigakure. They were also heading into a trap because only a mile in front of them, 12 other signatures were in positions that suggested they were poised to close ranks and surround the person. It wasn't hard to discover the reason for the supposed ambush. Although it had begun to wind down, the Shinobi World War was still going on, and although uncommon since much of the fighting was being done in smaller countries, incursions between the Great Five hidden villages happened. It was the strongest signature of the ambush group that gave him a clue as to what village the two sides were on. He recognized it as one identical to a boy from Iowa he had encountered over 20 years ago in one of his diplomatic visits to the Land of Earth. Madara spared him to see how strong he would be when he reached his potential, in hopes he might give him a good dance. If he's here, the group is from ... Madara mused. No doubt that means that the other is from Suna, with their recent skirmishes. The former clan held almost felt a grin tug at his lips. Perhaps the explosion-style user has learned to dance better since last we met. It had been a long time since he had actually fought, and the possibility of a good fight had his blood practically boiling in anticipation. The fact that this could possibly get him an asset in scouting Suna if he played his cards right was just a bonus. The wind brushed his black and gray bangs out of his right eye, his onyx gaze changed to a glowing red, with 3 tomos spinning around each in a menacing fashion. Savage grin in place, he disappeared in a burst of speed looking forward to the fight to come. Kazahana ran across the desert at a rapid pace. Small gouts of sand flew up behind her as she dashed with her body bent forward and arms trailing behind her. The sun beat down upon the back of her neck, which was covered by a tan scarf wound around her neck and shoulders. The slender Kunoichi had a surprisingly innocent appearance, with shoulder-length blonde hair which framed her kind-looking face, and blue eyes. She wore a simple outfit which did well at disguising her slightly buxom feminine figure along with a long, silver-white windflower-light silk scarf draped loosely around her neck. Keeping her bangs back from her forehead was her black-clothed headband. A soft sigh escaped her lips. She was on her way back from yet another mission to try and sabotage Iwa's war effort, something her magnet release Kekkei Jinkai made her especially equipped for, since she could turn their weapons against them or even break them down into particles of powder. She was honestly tired of the war and fighting in general. At 34 years old, she was considering retiring. She had had a very successful career, gaining the rank of Junin and becoming one of the strongest Kunoichi in the village. But now, all she really wanted to do was to settle down and start a family and watch proudly as her younger brother Fukurm attain his dream of being Kazukiage something he was being groomed for due to his innovation of their bloodline to mimic the abilities of Shukaku's Jinchuriki. I think I'll bring it up with Lord Kazukiage and Fukurm once I get back. It wasn't really that hard of a decision for her, the only reason it hadn't been made sooner was because her village needed her. In truth, she never really liked fighting, but it was necessary to protect her village and brother. Now, with him having far surpassed her, she could rest easy in retiring knowing the village was in good hands. Whether it was her distracting thoughts or premature relaxation from being in the land of wind, again Kazahana was snapped from her musings when she was suddenly put on edge. Her senses went into overdrive as she felt chakra signatures appearing around her. They were moving to completely surround her, and she had no time to avoid it. Damn it, it's too late to escape. She cursed as she realized she had walked straight into a trap. Her sapphire gaze lost its usual kind quality, being replaced by a fierce concentration as she examined the shinobi surrounding her. Involuntarily, her blood ran cold when she saw the single-sleeved red uniforms and the brown armor. She was surrounded by no less than a dozen Iwagakure Junin-level ninja. The one that caused the most dread stood directly in front of her with a grim expression. The man had spiky, light brown hair and prominent jawlines, and green eyes that showed the coolness of an experienced shinobi. He wore the standard Iwa uniform, with his right arm exposed save for his headband. He was tall, with an athletic build. His expression showed that while he was resolved he had regrets about his mission. She recognized him easily. He was Gari of the Explosion Release, head of the Explosion Corps. Alone she stood a good chance, but with 11 other Junin with him, she stood almost none. The Kunoichi ruthlessly squashed down on the sorrow that threatened to rear its head at what was to come. She was a proud member of Suna and she wouldn't die crying like a helpless girl. After a few minutes of a silent stare-off between her and Gari, the man finally spoke. "I'm afraid that you won't be making it back to your village, Kazahana-san," he told her. "The Tsuchikage has decided your brother is becoming too much of a threat, he wants him to be unbalanced, so it will be easier to take him down." The man paused, sighing before continuing. "Therefore, we've been ordered to eliminate you, thus removing 2 of the biggest threats from your village." At first, her heart had sunk upon hearing that they were indeed here to kill her. When she heard it was part of a plan to kill her baby brother, a white-hot rage filled her. She had helped raise him after their parents were killed, he was the only family she had and they wanted to take him away from her. Her arms rose up slowly. A scraping and clanking sound filled the air. Hundreds of kunai and shuriken began pouring out of the sleeves of her shirt. Puffs of smoke issued from various places on her clothing as even more weapons, including sei, chakram, blade staffs, and various other unique blades rose into the air. The weapons coalesced into a sphere of sharp pointy objects surrounding her from all sides and even above her. "Trying to kill me is one thing, but I won't let you lay a finger on my little brother," she declared fiercely. She prepared to launch her weapons at them and shred them to pieces. Most of the men surrounding her were wary of the intimidating wall of weapons. They arranged themselves into rows with a creepy sort of inanimate synchronization. "Magnet style. 1,000-blade dance," she cried as the spinning reached a fever pitch. A giant bzzzzzzzzz sound filled the air, as if many giant fans were blowing around her. Just when it appeared the blades were about to suddenly expand outwards, all motion abruptly ceased. Silence dominated for a second, save for the wind and the shifting sand. All at once, the blades began to fall, a tremendous and continuous clanging filling the air as they landed on top of each other. It threw up a cloud of sand that obscured Kazuhana from view. When the cloud of grit began settling, it revealed a large seal array underneath Kazuhana, glowing and pulsing with a faint blue light, drawing a pinkish-purple chakra from the weapons. The woman was left stunned in the field of weapons, mouth agape in shock. What's happening? My magnet release, it's not working. She gasped in horror. Her strongest abilities were out of reach. She was doomed. Lord Tsuchikage gave me a special seal designed to use to nullify your magnetic chakra for a small period of time. It's not versatile or powerful enough to be useful against someone like you, brother, but against you, explained Gari, his expression grim as ever. The man showed no sign of gloating over having outplayed her, seemingly resigned to carry out his mission. One of the Jinin surrounding her decided to speak up, his voice nervous as he did. Shouldn't we get this over with, before it stops working and she can use her Kekkei Genkai again? He asked. His fellow Jinin nodded their agreement. Gari sighed, nodding and giving his assent to attack. Kazuhana's heart sank. This was it. This was really it. Her only chance of victory had been stripped from her. She would die here, in this lonely desert. She thought of her brother, waiting for her to return so that they could celebrate his transition to Kazukiage. He would be all alone now. Tears welled in her eyes. Fukurem, I don't want to leave him alone. Please, someone, anyone help. She prayed. A tear slipped down her cheek. Seconds ticked by and nothing happened save for the Iwa ninja drawing weapons, kunai, and swords in some cases. The Jinin began to charge at her and still there was no answer. Just as Kazuhana had begun to lose all hope and say her goodbyes, a miracle happened. Out of nowhere, a massive killing intent slammed down on everyone. It was so great, it made Kazuhana's knees shake. She couldn't even imagine what it was doing to the Iwa ninja, who it seemed to be focused on. She could hear the rasps as they struggled to draw breath and see the trembling as they fought to stay standing. A small hope began to form within her. Could this be someone here to help? Her eyes darted around, trying to find whoever was producing this killing intent. Finally, she locked onto a man standing atop one of the dunes. She could tell from the height it was a man, clad in a black cloak with a large gunby strapped to his back. Kazuhana couldn't see much else of him due to the harsh sunlight. The only thing she could make out of the stranger was a pair of glowing red eyes glaring at the Iwa ninja. The mysterious stranger spoke in a cold voice, I hope you don't mind, but I saw you dancing and decided to cut in. Kazuhana witnessed the blood draining from Gari's face. Did he know this stranger somehow? If he did, the person filled him with dread. It can't be, you're supposed to be dead, what are you doing here? He asked shakily. She got the sense that the man on the dune was smirking when he spoke to Gari. You've grown up since last we met face to face. Tell me, how far have your skills come? He asked, not seeming truly concerned with getting an answer. I hope that this time, outdance will be much more entertaining. The fodder should spice things up. Kazuhana felt conflicted. The tone in his voice when the man spoke of the fodder was slightly abhorrent. At the same time, the man was saving her. She couldn't help but feel grateful that he would be taking them on for her. Who is he, Gari? Asked one of the Jinin. All 11 discreetly began getting their hands in position to begin jutsu. Madara, the whispered name, fell from his lips like lead, but all the Iwa ninja heard it and they began to tremble in fear. Kazuhana was puzzled, but she took it as a good sign that the Iwa ninja seemed to fear him. Perhaps I won't have to join mother and father after all. She thought hopefully. Madara couldn't help the bloodthirsty smile on his face as he looked down at the men below him. They clearly knew who he was and feared him. Retreat. Retreat now. Gari hissed to his men, causing them to begin to scatter. The retreat was halted. Madara smirked, sped towards one of the men in the back. He appeared from a burst of speed, his gunby extended backwards to come down on the man. The man raised his arms too black. Madara knew it was useless. He channeled wind chakra around the fan and cleanly bisected him. His body dropped to the ground with a wet thump. The sand beneath him was stained crimson, his organs spilled out onto the ground. TSK, how rude, leaving before I have my dance. Said Madara with a mock disappointed frown. He strode forward with a methodical gait, stopping to stand in between Kazuhana and Gari. Madara felt his pulse quickening. It had been a long time since he felt the rush of battle, his own unimaginable power coursing through him. He could see everything the Iwa ninja were about to do, the power of his Sharingan. A chill wind swept across the desert, blowing his bangs to the side. He and the Iwa ninjas both tensed in preparation for the fight to come. Now, even sparing her a glance, Madara spoke to the woman they had been about to kill. Leave, woman. I will take them from here. He told her bluntly. Madara saw her hesitate and then dart off in the direction of her village. Once she was a good distance away, a savage grin stole across his face. He leered at his opponents bloodthirstily. Shall we begin? The Iwa ninja sprang into action as one. They performed jutsu in tandem, trying to overpower him. "Good luck with that," he remarked snidely. "Earth style." Falling earth spears. Four of the ninja called as spikes of earth grew from the ground, quickly firing upon Madara from all sides. At the exact same moment, another group of four completed hand seals of their own. Earth style. Earth dragon. Four large dragons made of rock rose up from the ground, going into the air higher and higher, until they finally began to descend towards Madara, blocking escape from above. The Uchiha couldn't help but scoff at the attempts to take him down. His Sharingan began to spin rapidly, morphing into a new shape, the Eternal Magicum Sharingan. Three enlarged Tomo with circles at the end joined into a circle with a red shuriken shape in the center, and three bars spreading outwards from the Tomo. The attacks hit at the exact same time. The sound of earth shattering and rocks grinding filling the air. A large cloud of dust obscured the impact site. Dirt fell to the ground in showers. Madara grinned from within the cloud, a glowing blue ribsage surrounding him. He took pleasure in the terrified faces of the Iwa ninja when the dust cleared and they could see him once more. An impressive display, he complimented, though his next words caused the men to freeze. "But did you really think to fool me with such an obvious trick?" The ribsage rapidly began to grow, its skeletal structure expanding to be the head and torso of an skeletal-like figure surrounded by a blazing blue aura. The arms quickly swung outwards, slamming into the Iwa shinobi and sending them all flying. The bodies collapsed into piles of mud upon impact, revealing themselves to be Earth Release Shadow clones. It was a moment before the first Junin made a move. He emerged from the ground behind Madara to attempt to stab him in the back of the neck. Madara sidestepped the swing and snatched the man by the throat with a single hand. For a moment he stared into the terrified eyes of the man. His hand scrabbled at Madara's desperately and the man rasped for air. Madara squeezed hard and jerked his hand viciously to the side. A resounding and gruesome crack filled the air, like a dead tree branch snapping. Madara released his grip, the Junin collapsing lifelessly to the ground with his neck twisted at an odd angle. He let out a slight growl. Why did people have to act like rats? Madara had been hoping to at least break a sweat. Apparently that wouldn't be happening. "I don't have much patience for hide and seek," stated Madara. He placed his hands together, performing a series of 3 hand seals in such rapid succession, his hands were barely even blurs. Showers of sand erupted around him. Out of one came Gari, who cursed as he dodged a wooden spike emerging from a clone of Madara. His fellows weren't so lucky. They were impaled upon the spikes of other clones, each lifted into the air in a macabre display of might. Madara kept his eyes on the sole survivor. He performed a hand seal, which caused the clones to revert to roots and rejoin with his body. The corpses were left to tumble lifelessly to the ground. "Impressive, you managed to sense my clones in time to avoid them. Perhaps you can provide a better dance this time," Madara told the shocked ninja with a mocking smile. He saw a spark of anger in Gari's eyes when he looked at the corpses of his comrades. "Let's just get this over with," Gari grunted. Madara saw him begin to gather red energy around his hands. "Explosion style. Double Gatling ray," he called. Rapid fire, thin beams of energy began firing at Madara. Whenever they made contact with something, the beams would violently explode, sending showers of sand up into the air all around Madara. Despite this, the Uchiha dodged all the beams with relative ease. "You will have to do better than that if you wish to live long," stated Madara as the beams rained down around him. Gari's firing pace increased, but Madara was still able to dodge them easily. He couldn't help but feel a bit disappointed. Was this all the brat had? The beams suddenly ceased, leaving Madara in the center of a dust cloud. "Does he think he hit me?" He got his answer when another explosion, this one much larger, sounded. Dust kicked up around him into an even larger cloud. Within the cloud, Madara remained stoic as he squinted into the cloud of sand, tracking Gari's signature, not even flinching when the hood of his cloak was blown back off his head. He spotted 4 clones emerging around him, boxing him in with red energy glowing in their hands. As one, they launched their attacks at the same time Gari loosed his massive one. "Explosion style. Landmine fist," they called in unison. From all of the clones' palms, a wave of explosive red energy surged forth, quickly engulfing the Uchiha in a blinding light. Above, Gari's voice cried out. "Explosion style. Giant landmine fist." A massive thunderous explosion rocked that area of the desert, a miniature earthquake occurring as a massive cloud of sand was blasted into the air, filling the sky with a tidal wave of grit, even as the light from the energy of the techniques created a tremendous white dome. The dome was slow to dissipate, but when it did, a fog of dust larger than any of the ones before it billowed in the air. The flapping of Gari's clothes as he fell was the only sound that was made in the wake of the blast. Suddenly, from within the cloud, a giant blue sword emerged and bisected Gari from crotch to chin. His organs spilled out in a gory display of brutality. When the dust settled, his body lay a half-dozen yards in front of Madara. Madara was enveloped in a massive ogre-like figure made of cobalt chakra, with 2 faces and 4 arms. The chakra dissipated and left him alone in the crater. As it faded and his eyes returned to their usual onyx state, Madara looked over at Gari's mangled corpse. You indeed reached your potential. To force me to use Susanoo to avoid injury, most impressive. I enjoyed this dance, said Madara. He turned on his heel and locked eyes with a pair of shocked sapphire orbs. Madara clicked his tongue in annoyance. It was the woman from earlier. She gaped at him from the edge of the crater, her eyes wide as saucers. So you came back. I thought I told you to leave. Madara stated bluntly. He began to walk towards her from the bottom of the crater. Asahana panted. She paused in her flight from the would-be ambush. Her heart still beat madly from the adrenaline and a light sweat covered her skin. Slowly, she began to calm down from the near-death experience. Her mind drifted to her rescuer. When she thought she was about to be killed, he had stepped in and helped, allowing her to survive and return to her family and village. She felt guilty about leaving him alone. No matter how confident he had sounded, it was hard to fathom that he could handle them all on his own. The blonde bit her lip in worry. Eventually, she simply gave an exasperated sigh. She couldn't simply continue on and ignore what he had done for her. She at least had to make sure he was okay. Turning back the way she came, Kazuhana began to dash across the sand once more. She practically flew across the desert, trying to get to the side of the ambush in time to help her savior. Almost halfway to the location of the ambush, a massive explosion went off, causing a slight tremor even from the distance she was at, and sending up a wave of sand that threatened to block out the sun. As the shadow of the towering cloud fell over her, Kazuhana redoubled her pace. Worried about the well-being of the man that had helped her. It took but a few minutes for her to reach the area where the ambush site had been, and the sand had begun settling by then, only being a slight haze now. Where once there was flat desert, she stood on the edge of a large crater, looking down at the man that had saved her, as a massive ogre-like construct of cobalt chakra dissipated from around him. Besides some singing on his clothes, the man seemed to not have a scratch on him. Seeming to sense her, he looked up and locked eyes with her, his onyx eyes met her wide sapphire ones. Awe and a slight amount of fear filled her being as she looked upon the intense black eyes, framed by his blue-tinted black hair with strips of steel gray here and there. So you came back. I thought I told you to leave. The man stated bluntly, causing her to wince slightly at the emotionless tone. It was impossible to tell whether he was angry or not. With a gulp to steady her nerves, she answered the unasked question. I was worried you'd have trouble with them, so I decided to come back. She stated, her eyes showing her sincerity. Are you hurt? That was a big explosion just now. Asked Kazuhana. The man cocked his head to the side in confusion. He looked at her strangely. Tell me, what is your name and why were they attempting to kill you? He asked. He had finally made it up the side of the crater to stand in front of her. Kazuhana hesitated at the reminder of the attempt on her life. More importantly, the reason behind it. My name is Kazuhana, I'm a Jinin of Suna. They were trying to kill me so that my brother would be emotionally vulnerable and easier to kill, she said. Madara's eyebrow rose. Youc, he's being groomed to be Kazukiage, so killing him would be a huge blow. Elaborated Kazuhana with a grim expression, getting a nod of understanding from Madara. However, the grim mood only lasted for a few moments before she seemed to brighten up. Kazuhana looked at him curiously. She hadn't encountered anyone that looked quite like him in the land of wind. It was especially odd to see someone with black hair there. Anyways, who are you? I'd like to know my savior's name. She asked with a kind smile. My name is Madara. Madara replied. Kazuhana shifted a little uncomfortably under his scrutinizing gaze. She felt like those black eyes were peering into her soul. Was that interest she saw in his? Tell me, Kazuhana-san, you seem rather kind to be a ninja, why did you choose to be one? He asked, a slight curiosity in his tone. Kazuhana blushed slightly in embarrassment at the question. Of course that was what he was interested in. It was one she had been asked many times because her innocent appearance and kind demeanor seemed to be inconsistent with what was required of a kunoichi. This was highlighted by her dislike of fighting. Shuffling her feet uncomfortably, she explained to him. Well, my parents died when my brother and I were still young, killed by enemy ninja. She began. After that, I decided to become a ninja so I could protect my little brother and well, here I am, one of the strongest kunoichi in our village. Explained Kazuhana. She looked at him intensely, a sudden strength in her eyes that belied her innocent appearance. You see, I believe that you are only truly powerful when you have someone you love and want to protect. It pushes you to work just that little bit harder to gain the power, for their sake. Do you have anyone like that? She responded, her expression very sincere. A melancholy look flashed across Madara's face. Though it didn't last long, Kazuhana could still see the sadness in his eyes. She almost gasped. She could recognize that look anywhere. It spoke of a tragic past and someone who had lost someone dear. She had seen it in her own eyes for some time after her parents' death. "I did once, long ago. But that is no more," he told her. If he was feeling any sort of emotion, Madara concealed it very well. "You are an interesting one, perhaps we will meet again," stated Madara. He began walking in the direction that Kazuhana recognized as a circuitous route to Suna. Before he had gotten more than 10 feet, she called out to him. "I hope we do, and I hope you can find someone to protect once again, Madara-san." The Suna Kunoichi told him, eyes shining kindly as she looked at his back. She heard him reply, his voice so quiet you could barely distinguish it from the whispering of the wind. Kazuhana wondered if it was her imagination, but it sounded like he said, a new person to protect and love. Perhaps. Present. Madara's eyes shone with unshed tears as he remembered his very first encounter with his late wife. She had done so much for him, pulling him from the darkness and into the light, giving him a new purpose. "Your grandmother was a great woman. I was a very different man at the time we met, consumed by hatred and on my way down a dark path. She had the unique ability to change people for the better, and she certainly did it for me. It's because of her that I have never fallen to that hate again. I could never face her if I were to do so," said Madara, looking at his grandson. He saw a lot of his late wife in the young child. "So what happened after you met her?" Madara sighed, once more immersing himself in memories of the past. "For a time, we were happy. We eventually married and not too long after, your father was born. But soon after, things changed. One day, your grandmother took your father to a carnival nearby. On their way back, they were attacked by missing nin-bandits. Your grandmother managed to fight and kill them, but not before being mortally wounded. By the time I arrived, she was already dead and your father was missing." Madara clenched his fist. The tears that had been swimming in his eyes began to spill. I tried to save her. With the power of my Rinnegan, I managed to bring her soul back, at least temporarily." Naruto gave him a confused look. "What's the Rinnegan?" he asked. Madara felt a bit of the sadness he was feeling leave at his grandson's innocent curiosity. It was so similar to his wife's. He wiped the tears from his eyes and gave Naruto a brief history of the Rinnegan and its abilities. When he had made sure Naruto understood it, Madara began to tell his story again. "Now, where was I? Oh, yes. As I said, I was able to revive your grandmother temporarily. You see, while my jutsu returned her, it didn't repair her body," he told Naruto grimly. "She only lived long enough to tell me that she had seen a kind man come and take Minato before her soul departed and to tell me she loved me. I nearly broke down after that. Without her light, it became harder to fight the darkness. But I had to. She made me promise never to fall to that curse again, and I gave my word that I wouldn't," Madara said softly. He felt Naruto pat his arm comfortingly and smiled at the small boy. With a shaky breath, he pulled himself together, looking back up at his grandson. His eyes reminded him so much of his wife, just like his son's had. Madara shook his head. He really was growing old, constantly lost in memories of his long life. "After your grandmother died, I took her body back to her home in the land of rivers and buried her. From there, I set out to try and find your father, a journey that took me 22 years. I finally found him in this very village. His first name was still the same, but he had received a new name in the orphanage," said Madara. He saw Naruto lean forward in anticipation. The boy looked at him pleadingly. "Who was he? Tell me about him, please. I've always wanted to know who my parents were," Naruto begged. Madara frowned at the desperation in his grandson's voice. It was a reminder of how he had lived his childhood so far in scorn. He smiled softly and placed a hand on Naruto's shoulder. "Of course I'll tell you who he was. I'll tell you who both your parents were," he told Naruto warmly. Naruto beamed happily at him. With a smile, he began to tell Naruto who his parents were, both their names and his people. He told him of Minato's genius and his quiet yet kind nature. He also told him about his mother, her fiery attitude and brash way of talking to others. Madara continued until he had exhausted the knowledge he had gained of his son and his son's wife through his spying in the village. Although there were a few tears, they were happy ones. But Madara could see that something was bothering Naruto. He tried to hide it, but no matter how happy he became, it never disappeared. Finally, Naruto asked the question that was on his mind. It was one Madara had been hoping to put off. "Grandfather, you said that my mother was the Jinchuriki before me, right?" Naruto asked. Madara frowned. He could guess where this was going. He nodded nonetheless. "Then how did it escape? And why did they choose to seal it in me?" Naruto asked with a deep frown. The warmth from seeing his grandson's happiness at learning who his parents were faded. In its place was a somberness. He had been expecting the question eventually, but he was hoping it would come at a later time. "So I suppose I should tell you. You remember what I said about the other Rinnegan user? Madara asked Naruto. He nodded his head. On the night you were born, your mother's seal was weakened. When a female Jinchuriki gives birth, her seal becomes weak. Someone sought to take advantage of this when you were born. A masked man who possessed the Sharingan. He said darkly. Naruto gasped in shock. He appeared that night and forced your father to escape with you, leaving him alone with your mother. He extracted the Kikbi from her and set it loose on the village. I'm not sure how, but your father eventually broke his control over Kikbi. After he did, Minato teleported it away. I arrived soon after. When I reached the place he had teleported it to, your parents had already begun the sealing. Kushina held the Kikbi down, while Minato did the sealing. Unfortunately, Kushina's weakness got the best of her. She suffered a coughing fit and her control on her chains holding the Kikbi weakened. Kikbi took advantage and tried to prevent itself from being sealed by killing you. Your parents stopped it. They threw themselves in front of its claw and kept it from reaching you. They sacrificed themselves to save you, Madara explained somberly. He looked Naruto in the eyes. Tears were swimming in the young boy's eyes. They did. He stuttered. Madara nodded seriously. Yes, they did. Your parents loved you very much, you were the best thing to ever happen to them. He told Naruto. The boy was still frowning slightly, though it had softened considerably. Then why did they seal the Kikbi into me? Didn't they know what it would be like? Naruto asked. Madara sighed heavily. That was a difficult question to answer. He knew his son had at least a partially good reason for his actions, but another part was due to his naive nature. My son, your father was an incredibly kind man. Perhaps too kind. Unfortunately, he could sometimes be naive. He had faith that the villagers would see you as a hero, faith in their goodness. After losing so much to the Kikbi, there was little chance of being a hero. However, Madara looked at Naruto, who looked deeply upset. That was not the entire reason. I managed to get close enough to catch the very end of your parents' discussion about sealing the Kikbi into you. You see, as Hokage, he wished to preserve the balance of the tailed beasts. Without a Jinchuriki, Konoha would have lacked a valuable war deterrent that would have left it vulnerable to enemy attack in its weakened condition. The biggest reason though, was that he knew the masked man would be coming back for it. He wanted to entrust you with its power so that you could stop the man when he came again. After all, who better to trust than his son? Madara could tell his words had gotten through to the boy. The tears that had been swimming in his eyes now poured down in thick streams from his eyes. Naruto began to sniffle. Well, then I guess I'm going to have to prove them are right. Naruto said. Madara smiled warmly. He placed his son on his grandson's shoulder, causing the boy to look up at him with his slightly puffy eyes. Then I will help you to train. I'll teach you all that I can in order to help you defeat that man one day. He promised. Naruto beamed at him. Madara was taken by surprise when the child leapt from the bed and into his arms, hugging him tightly around the neck. He could feel his grandson's hot tears creating a wet spot on his robe. Thank you, grandfather. I can't believe I finally have a family. Naruto cried. Madara placed his arms around his grandson and patted his back gently. There, no need to cry. You don't have to worry about being alone anymore, Naruto. He said softly. Sitting there comforting his grandson, Madara made a vow. Minato, Kushina, Kazuhana. I will not fail, not this time. Not again. Naruto will grow to be a better shinobi and man than any of our family before him. This, I swear. The breeze passed through the trees, causing a constant rustling. The cool air like an icy chill on Shisui's slightly sweaty skin, easing his exhaustion somewhat. Blood ran down from his now empty right eye socket. He traveled at fast speeds through the foliage of the forests that made up Konoha's training grounds. Leaves of varying shades of green, from lime to emerald, blurring into a wall of color due to his speed. What do I do now? I can't go back to the clan like this, there'll be trouble because of the eye Danzum took, so what now? The Uchiha thought. The unruly haired Uchiha couldn't help but curse as he leapt from branch to branch. The presumably former one-eyed elder had ruined everything. Why did the old bastard have to interfere? His orders came from the third, yet the old warhawk had interfered. The bastard always had to think that he knew better, that the third was too soft, and he made decisions to interfere with the thirds that usually made things worse. None more so than the current one. He had been so close to stopping his clan's coup d'etat against Konoha. It was rather simple, use his unique Jinjutsu granted by his Manjukum Sharingan on the leaders of the clan to stop the coup. But that was useless now because the former Anbu commander of the disbanded root program Danzum Shimura had intercepted him and stolen his right eye. Now he had to somehow keep the other out of his grubby hand because it would be disastrous if the Warhawk got a hold of the full power of the Kodomatsu Kami. Still he wanted his eye to help in protecting Konoha even after his death. That meant he had to entrust it to someone. As that fact crossed his mind, the one-eyed man's features slowly twisted into a smirk. He wanted to entrust his powers to someone he knew would use them to protect the village. The unruly haired uchiha knew the perfect person to fit that bill, a person who already had a mission to stop the coup. Not only that, but maybe, just maybe, he could give Konoha a new set of Manjukam eyes to protect it from the shadows for years to come. His smirk melted into a melancholy smile as he finally cemented his plan. It seems I should get Itachi to meet me at the usual place for a final farewell, and hopefully, I can give him the edge he needs to complete his mission successfully. The man stopped briefly on a branch. Around him the forest was painted orange as the last rays of light started to disappear on the horizon. Crickets could be heard chirping in the night as he flashed through a series of hand seals, ending on the ram hand seal. Channeling chakra to his tooth to sharpen it and pierce his thumb. With a quick swipe across his palm that smeared the resulting blood across it, the unruly haired uchiha slammed his palm onto the wide branch he stood on. Poof. A plume of smoke erupted from where his palm met the bark as the uchiha prepared to send his message to his friend that was like a younger brother, feeling a twinge of sadness at the conversation to come. An inky black curtain stretched across the sky and tiny pinpricks of light were beginning to come out with one single, large white orb on high. The silvery light of the moon shone down on the rocky terrain to the side of the Hokage monument, casting the world into a grey tone. Shisui stood on the cliff overlooking the Naka River with a small waterfall directly across from him. By now, the blood on his face had dried into a solid dark red sheet down his right cheek. Gazing out across the canyon with his single good eye, Shisui reflected on the events of the day. The day had started so well he had planned on ending the ridiculous coup of his clan with his special genjutsu, but then, the damned bandage-faced fossil had interfered, stealing his eye and sending his little drones after him. He had gotten a slight break when 3 of them had broken off, allowing him to escape and get word to Itachi. The really strange part was, when he went back later and followed the trail of the 3 root ninja that had broken off, it had ended at the edge of a waterfall, and the only thing he had found was 3 patches of blackened earth. I wonder what happened. It looked almost as if fires had been set there, fires to burn bodies. Could they have been killed? But by who? This thought was prominent in Shisui's mind. As much as he hated to admit it, root Anbu were skilled. For 3 to be killed was no small feat, and to be able to get rid of all traces of them to the point that even he couldn't find them was even harder. With a sigh, Shisui closed his eye for a moment before opening it slowly. He said, "So, you've finally arrived." Itachi behind him, a second man who looked to be about 13 or 14 walked out onto the cliff, looking at Shisui with confusion. I had jet black hair that was bound into a low ponytail and onyx eyes. Pronounced tear troughs extended underneath his eyes and his bangs were parted down the center. He wore the traditional Anbu attire with an uchiha high collar shirt underneath his gray body armor, a katana strapped to his back. "Why did you call me here, Shisui? Shouldn't we be at the meeting? The clan will get suspicious if I keep missing them," Itachi said as he approached the older uchiha. Still looking at the small waterfall across from him, Shisui spoke without turning. "It no longer looks like the uchiha coup d'etat can be prevented." Itachi's eyes widened at Shisui's words. "If civil war begins in the Leaf, the other villages will be like sharks smelling blood in the water and surely move to invade," stated Shisui bluntly. He looked at the sky. "Real war will then break out." Shisui finally turned to face Itachi, who gasped in shock at his closed eye and the large trail of blood. "When I tried to stop the coup d'etat with the Kodamatsukami, Danzm stole my right eye," said Shisui as he looked at Itachi with his one good Manjukam Sharingan. "He doesn't trust me. He intends to protect the village his way, no matter what it takes or how it looks." Turning, Shisui glanced at the canyon beside him. "I suspect he will come after my left eye as well," said Shisui as he reached up to his eye. "So I want to give it to you before he has a chance," he continued, a sick squelching sound filling the air as he ripped the eyeball from the socket, the optical nerve and blood vessel dangling from the orb clutched loosely in his hand. Blood dripped from his hand, which was stained with the crimson liquid. "You're the only person I can count on, my best friend." Smiling, he extended his hand to his friend. "Please protect the village in the honor of the Uchiha name," said Shisui. Tears began to swim in Itachi's eyes. He slowly took the eye, ignoring the sliminess as he clutched it softly. "Why are you speaking this way, Shisui?" asked Itachi, although he already knew, he just didn't want to admit it. Shisui smiled teasingly at his friend. "Come now, we both know that if the clan finds out that my eye was taken, the coup will be hastened. To prevent this, I will make it look like I killed myself. I already left a suicide letter, now I will throw myself over the side of this cliff and eliminate all traces of my body," he replied. Slowly, he began to back up, still facing Itachi's way as he threw his parting words at him. "Goodbye, my friend. Protect the clan name and Sasuke. She is the future of our clan," said Shisui. "Wait, Shisui, don't do this," protested Itachi, only to be ignored. Shisui turned and dashed to the edge of the cliff, throwing himself backwards and over the side. Itachi quickly dashed after him, stopping on the edge to see his friend falling towards the river below, forming hand seals rapidly. A peaceful smile was on his face, even as white-hot flames began to engulf his body. Itachi looked on in despair as his friend burnt himself to ashes, his Sharingan becoming active. The Tomo began to spin rapidly until they morphed into an all-new shape, joining together with the pupil at the ends, forming a tri-bladed pinwheel. Shisui. He shouted while he was forced to watch his friend disappear, the peaceful smile never leaving his face. The flames licked at his body, and his skin began to crack and blister as it slowly burnt. The sickly sweet feeder of cooked human flesh filled the air around his body, disappearing into a trail of ashes. Itachi, I have faith in you. This way, my death will mean something, and you can save the honor of the Uchiha name. Thought Shisui as he finally disappeared, only a trail of ash that slowly fell through the air and landed in the water below, being swept away on the current. With his dying breath, he had left his friend with a gift to help him for years to come. Chapter end. Chapter 3. Holding Back and Prelude. In the hidden grotto underneath the Naka River, Naruto now 8 stood in front of his grandfather who was using an old kama as a makeshift cane. Behind him, the cave's small waterfall cascaded lightly into the crystal clear pool, which seemed to glow with an inner light due to the small shaft of sunlight that shone down from a small crack in the ceiling. The ground had been evened out, all the stalagmites being removed in favor of a smooth floor to create a small area perfect for training. Naruto had grown slightly in the past year, being slightly above average in height for his age. His hair had begun to darken slightly, with black strands here and there, and it had lost some of its spikiness, becoming more shaggy in appearance. He wore a simple attire, with an Uchiha-style high-collar shirt and a pair of tan shorts. The past year had been amazing for the blonde. After he met his grandfather, he had begun to live inside the cave with him after setting up a secret passageway between it and his apartment building so that no one would see him going to the waterfall every day. Something Naruto had learned rather quickly was that Madara was different from most grandparents. He had a different concept of fun activities. Whereas most people would teach their grandchildren to fly a kite or dote on them with sweats, Madara would show him how to forge his own kunai and shuriken and teach him to play shogi. But Naruto's favorite activity was probably the training they did together. Each day Madara would help him train after the academy, and each day he learned something new. That's why he stood in the training field they had created down here, because his grandfather had told him that they were going to begin something special today. So, what are we doing today, grandfather? Asked Naruto, barely controlling the urge to bounce eagerly. Madara had never referred to anything as special when telling him of a new thing to learn, so this must be really special if he would say that. You have been doing well in your nature transformation training, so as a treat, I'm going to teach you a jutsu that is very special to our clan. It's a special rite of passage, and once you've mastered it, you'll be considered a full Uchiha, said Madara, with smirk. That really got Naruto's attention. Ever since he had learned that he was part of the Uchiha clan, he had learned everything he could of their history and customs, so he knew right away what his grandfather was referring to. In fact, he had been bugging Madara to teach it to him ever since he had found out about the rite of passage. Instantly a wide smile spread across Naruto's face, eyes wide with wonder. Excitement began to well up inside him. Really? You're going to teach me the great fireball jutsu? Asked Naruto excitedly. Yes, now come, I will show you how to perform it, then it is up to you to master. This is one jutsu you can't use your Sharingan to learn, it must be learned on your own. Replied Madara as he made his way over to the pond, walking out onto the traditional wooden bridge. The entire way, his steps were accompanied by the sound of his improvised cane tapping on stone, and then wood. Naruto followed him eagerly, standing next to him as he stopped at the middle of the bridge. Madara dropped his cane. He stood at the center of the bridge. Turning to Naruto, he said, when performing this technique, you must first knead the chakra inside your body, turning it into fire, and then perform the hand seals, and finally, release the fire through your mouth. Pay close attention. Naruto nodded and fixed his attention solely on his grandfather. Madara was performing the hand seals slowly so that he could follow them, and Naruto did, committing each seal to memory. Once all half-dozen seals were performed, his grandfather's chest puffed up. He brought his right hand to his mouth, forming a circle with the first 2 fingers and thumb. A massive orb of roaring flames 15 feet in diameter issued forth, shooting out over the water and creating a circle on the surface. The liquid recoiling from the flames as steam hissed upwards in wispy tendrils. The flames continued for well over a minute, the constant roar filling the cave, while Naruto looked at it in wonder. The flames, it was amazing. He could feel the heat licking his skin, even from his position behind his grandfather. Slowly the flames died down, and the water returned to its previously serene state. Madara turned to him with a smirk. Once you can sustain it at that size and intensity for a minute, I will consider it mastered. said Madara. He stood back to allow Naruto to step up and try the technique. Naruto was nervous as he stepped up to the side of the bridge. It wasn't until just then that he realized how important this was, both in regards to clan traditions and him personally. He really didn't want to screw up his first attempt at the jutsu in front of his grandfather, he didn't want to let him down. Naruto closed his eyes, taking a deep breath as he slowly reached inside himself to his sizable chakra reserves. Carefully, he focused it into his lungs, willing the chakra to start heating up and turn into fire. Finally he felt confident enough to begin the hand seals. Snake, ram, monkey, boar, horse, tiger, thought Naruto as he methodically formed the hand seals. His chest puffed out, lungs expanding as he brought his hand to cup his lips. Fire style. Fireball jutsu, he said mentally, determination surging forth. From Naruto's mouth issued a stream of orange flames, coalescing into a fireball that was 4 feet in diameter. The fire lasted for a short quarter of a minute before tapering off and disappearing. Naruto looked at the place where his fireball had been with a slightly disappointed expression. He had been hoping to make it at least a third of the size of his grandfather's, but it hadn't happened. That disappointment changed when his grandfather spoke behind him. Very good for a first try. Keep working on it and you should have this mastered in no time. I think I'll go lie down for a bit while you work on this. Madara complimented him. Naruto's heart lifted and he beamed under his grandfather's praise. Although Madara was supportive and helped whenever he was having trouble, he didn't give praise lightly, only if he really deserved it. In Naruto's mind, that always made it even better since he knew he wasn't just trying to boost his confidence. Madara smiled gently at him. He ruffled his hair when he passed Naruto. Naruto shouted a half-hearted hey. The old Uchiha simply chuckled, continuing on his way into the house. He paused just as he was about to enter the house, turning to call back across the cavern, "Oh, and don't forget, I need to draw some blood from you again today. Be sure to preserve some energy." Naruto huffed in annoyance. For reasons he refused to explain, he had been drawing Naruto's blood frequently. The only thing that he would say is that it was for a special project. The blonde was dying to know what that was. Again? When are you going to tell me what all this mysterious blood drawing is about? The only reply was a chuckle. A sigh escaped Naruto's lips when he walked into his classroom in the academy. He hated coming to class. It was a waste of time in his opinion. Ever since he had begun training with his grandfather, his skills had progressed well beyond what they were currently doing, which was mostly accuracy and chakra control. Not only was he well versed in the physical side, but also the history and theoretical aspect. So all in all, it was extremely boring. If the fact that the content of the lesson was far behind what he knew wasn't enough, it was made worse by the fact that he still had to maintain the image of the class dead last due to the suspicion that would befall him should he have a drastic increase in skills. Madara had told him to continue to act like the class dead last, despite the fact that he didn't like it. Naruto went along with it, if only to set his grandfather's mind at ease. He had even begun to wear a transformation to hide his physical features as the changes grew ever more drastic. The blue-eyed Uchiha had also swapped out his usual clothes he wore at home for much more colorful clothes, a matching orange hoodie and pair of shorts. With another sigh, Naruto cast his gaze across the room surreptitiously, looking for any changes in the environment, something Madara had drilled into him. Everything seemed normal, most of the students had already arrived and taken their seats. He idly noticed indigo-haired Hinata Hyuga sat huddled in on herself anxiously in her seat in the back. Occasionally throwing glances his way with her pale eyes, something that was trademark of her clan, before looking away with her face reddening. He still couldn't figure out why she did that, and his grandfather was no help, he simply chuckled in amusement whenever Naruto brought it up. She seemed to be trying to disappear into her bulky tan jacket. Naruto made his way to his seat next to Shikamaru to wait for the rest of the class and the instructor to arrive. Shikamaru lifted his head up slightly, looking at him in boredom. Shikamaru, the heir to the Nara clan, shared the defining traits of most of the men in his clan. They were all geniuses and all of them were lazy as could be. It was rare to see Shikamaru's narrow brown eyes filled with anything but laziness or annoyance. His clothes seemed to reflect his attitude, as the only bright colors were the Nara clan symbol on the front of his gray t-shirt and the white bandages that strapped his kunai holster to his brown shorts. Despite his usual attitude, a slight glint of amusement entered his eyes for a moment. "So, you actually showed up. Gonna try to beat Sasuke again?" Unlike the others, Naruto got the feeling that Shikamaru knew that he was holding back. He was certain the Nara took pleasure in teasing him about the fact that he always had to let everyone else win. Naruto gritted his teeth, forcing down the urge to throttle the lazy boy before launching into his act for the day. "Just wait, Pineapple Head, today's the day I'm gonna kick her ass. You hear that, Sasuke?" said Naruto, directing the last bit at the Uchiha princess in the row next to them, who had a pleasant and polite expression on her face. Sasuke was the second child of his mother's friend Makoto Uchiha, and she looked like the spitting image of her mother. Her long raven-colored hair was held up in a ponytail that left her bangs to frame her cheeks, which were still slightly chubby with baby fat, and her big onyx black eyes. Like most of her clan, she wore dark clothes, including a black Uchiha-style high-collar shirt with the clan symbol emblazoned on the back. The girl glanced at him before turning her gaze back towards the board, the pleasant expression never leaving her face. She replied, "Whatever you say, Uzumaki." On his right, Shikamaru shook his head at his outburst. "Shouldn't you be embarrassed that your number one goal is to beat a girl? Even if she is the top student?" asked Nara. Puffing his cheeks up, Naruto pretended to be angry for a few moments. He turned his head away with a humph. In truth, one of the least favorite parts of his act was constantly picking fights with her, as she was actually very kind to him most of the time, despite how much he must have annoyed her. But he had to keep up the image of a cocky idiot. "Just you wait and see, today's the day," declared the blonde. An amused voice then called out from the front of the classroom. "Is that so, Naruto? Glad to hear it. You'll get your chance to prove it right away, because the first lesson is target practice." The attention of all the students was drawn to the front of the class, where a very tan-skinned man stood with a smile on his face. "You bet, Iruka-sensei, I'm going to beat her today, you'll see. I guarantee it, as future Hokage," said Naruto loudly. This drew a hail of jeers as the rest of the class mocked the blonde. Iruka threw Naruto a sympathetic look as the insults began. "Sure, you will dead last. You're right, you can't even beat Shikamaru's lazy butt. No way are you gonna beat Sasuke." Finally, Iruka had enough. He used his patented big head jutsu to increase the size of his head. "Alright, that's enough, quiet down so we can begin class," yelled Iruka. Instantly the room fell into silence as the children looked at him with comically wide eyes. As he calmed, Iruka's head reduced to its normal size, and when next he spoke, it was in his usual calm voice. "Alright then, let's get right to it. Make sure you have your kunai and shuriken, then exit the room single file and head to the target range outside," commanded the scar-faced man. A shuffling arose as students followed the instructions, standing up to check their kunai and shuriken holsters. Naruto himself simply stood up and began exiting the room. He made sure that he knew exactly what equipment was on him at all times, so checking was pointless. Not far behind him was Shikamaru, who muttered, "Man, why couldn't it have been history again? At least I can nap during that. This is such a drag." Behind him, Chimjai nodded sympathetically to his friend's words, whereas Naruto withheld a snort. Yep, definitely no need to worry about Shikamaru telling people he was holding back. He'd find it too troublesome. After exiting the school building, the class lined up at the target range. They stood on a red line that had been marked on the dusty ground of the training area. There was some chattering from the children as they conversed in the brief pause before the practice began. Across from them was a wall with many human-shaped wooden cutouts, with targets marked where the head, heart, and stomach were. "Alright everybody, quiet down. We've done this before, so you should know what to do. Throw your kunai and shuriken until you're out and then wait patiently. I will tell you when everyone is out and then you'll retrieve your weapons and we'll start again. I'm going to be watching and giving tips, so don't worry if you have trouble. Does everybody understand?" The students replied as one, and a chorus of "Yes, Iruka-sensei" went up. Smiling, the tan-skinned instructor stepped back behind the line. "Alright, start in 3, 2, 1, go." As soon as the word go left his mouth, the students immediately began to throw their weapons. The sound of metal slicing through the air and the solid thunk of the metal tools hitting wood resounded throughout the courtyard as students began throwing kunai and shuriken left and right. Naruto reached into his hip pouch and pulled out a handful of shuriken. Pretending to take careful aim, he let loose the projectiles, sending them careening towards the cutout. Just as he had planned, all of them missed the bull's eyes. Of the 4 shuriken he threw, 1 ricocheted off the stone wall with Hing, 2 hit on the edge of the wood figure nowhere near the targets, and only 1 managed to hit inside the outer ring of one of the bull's eyes. "Nice try, but you're throwing them too hard, Naruto. The secret is in the way you flick your wrist, not in your arm," said Iruka as he walked up behind the blonde. Naruto looked at Iruka, squinting his eyes. He rubbed the back of his head in embarrassment. "I know that was just a warm-up, just you wait, next time I'll definitely get all bull's eyes," replied Naruto, sticking to his overconfident persona. Iruka shook his head in exasperation with a sigh before walking off to help other students. Naruto looked back at the target dummy. Looks like it's going to be another day of pretending to suck. The class stayed outside for practice for another hour and a half. Over and over, they repeated the process of throwing their kunai and shuriken and then retrieving them and beginning again upon Iruka's command. Throughout the session, Naruto made sure to glance at his fellow classmates, occasionally feigning frustration to make sure he was doing the worst. Not once did he hit a bull's eye, and he only improved marginally. As he was doing this, he noted that in particular, Sasuke was doing very well. She rarely misses a bullseye. Impressive, her accuracy might even rival mine. He thought as he saw the Ravenet hit another bullseye. Finally, after an hour and a half of target practice, Iruka called a halt. "Alright everybody, that's enough for today. You can all go enjoy your lunches, but be back in the classroom for ninjutsu theory in an hour." After saying this, Iruka himself began to meander off on his way to eat his own lunch and hurry back to prepare the lesson. An excited clamor arose. The children began to break off into groups, intent on enjoying their lunch. Naruto himself stood there for a moment, collecting his shuriken. He had just managed to get the last 3 kunai when a cluster of male students passed by and he overheard what the lead one was saying. "Man, did you see how bad the dead last did? He could barely get 1 shuriken in the target. I can't believe that dummy thought he would do better than Sasuke." The boy and his friends all began laughing at the insult while Naruto's hands gripped the 3 kunai tightly. He tried to shake it off and ignore it, he really did. But in the end, Naruto had to let off some steam. Naruto glanced back at his target dummy and then quickly around to make sure no one was watching. A flick of his wrist sent the 3 kunai in his hand whistling through the air. Each one embedded themselves into the wood with a solid and resounding thunk, burying themselves nearly to the hilt directly in the center of the bullseye. "Idiots, if only they knew how much effort it takes to be worse than them," muttered Naruto as he walked away without even glancing back. If he had, he might have noticed a pair of large onyx eyes fix on him, their owner unsure of what had just occurred. While the rest of the kids began to trickle out of the training field, Sasuke decided to stay behind for a bit of extra practice. The Uchiha princess knew she was far beyond the rest in skills, but she still wasn't anywhere near her brother or even her mother in skills. Sasuke especially wanted to reach her mother's level of skill. She was one of the few Uchiha females to become a ninja, as well as being one of the fewer still to attain the rank of Jonin. On top of that, she was the only woman of her generation to have awakened the Sharingan, and Sasuke wanted to be just like her. Just as she was about to begin to throw her projectiles, she heard a mocking jeer drift across the training field, the source being a group of boys primarily composed of ones that had crushes on her. "Man, did you see how bad that dead last did? He could barely get 1 shuriken in the target. I can't believe that dummy thought he would do better than Sasuke." Sasuke had to roll her eyes at this. Honestly, she found those boys obnoxious and annoying. While they derided Naruto's skills, theirs weren't much better. The Uchiha girl actually felt sort of bad for the blonde. Every time he tried to succeed, he would fail. Shaking her head, her ponytail swaying from the motion, she was halted once more, this time by 3 solid and unmistakable thunking sounds. She snapped her gaze to the source. There were 3 kunai embedded deeply in one of the wooden cutouts, each one directly at the center of one of the bull's eyes. "Where did those come from?" wondered the Uchiha princess. Her gaze swept the training field in confusion, finally locking on the back of a spiky-haired blonde boy wearing an orange sleeveless hoodie. "Naruto? Did he do that? But how?" she wondered. She followed his departure intently. Sasuke stood there a moment, lost in thought. Finally, she shook her head, resolving to look into it later, before turning her gaze to the target in front of her. Sasuke let loose a relieved sigh when she exited the academy for the day. The rest of the day had seemed to drag by slowly after the strange occurrence on the target range. Her mind had been on that and she had been distracted for the rest of the day's lessons. Looking towards the exit of the courtyard, elation flooded through her. Her brother was leaning against the fence. Smiling widely, she rushed across the courtyard to meet him. "Big brother, what are you doing here?" Sasuke barreled into her brother, giving him a hug around the middle. Itachi chuckled at her actions. He ruffled her hair lightly. Sasuke slapped his hand away. She began to pout when he acted as if it was no big deal. "What, I can't come pick you up from class?" he asked teasingly. Itachi took her by the hand and the two began to walk through the village. They walked in silence for a while until finally Itachi broke it. "So, how did the academy go today? Did anything interesting happen?" Sasuke almost tripped over her feet. His question reminded her of what happened with Naruto. When she didn't immediately respond, her brother looked at her with a raised eyebrow. "Oh, so something did happen?" he asked. "Maybe, not necessarily. It was just strange." She bit her lip in hesitation. She wasn't sure if she wanted to tell him. "You know that kid, Naruto?" Itachi nodded. Sasuke quickly told him about what she had seen, shaking her head in confusion in the end. It was hard for her to wrap her head around the idea of Naruto being so skilled. "I don't know what to think. The way they hit the target was like he had done it 1,000 times, but he always does so bad in class. It just doesn't make sense. What do you think?" Itachi stayed silent for a moment, seemingly in deep contemplation. Finally he turned to her with a teasing grin. "It sounds like he interests you. Does my little sister have a crush?" Sasuke felt her face heat up at his words. She didn't have a crush on Naruto, but the insinuation was embarrassing. Her cheeks puffed up in anger and she smacked Itachi's arm with her fist as hard as she could. Unfortunately, if he felt anything, he didn't show it. He didn't even flinch. "I don't have a crush on him, Itachi," she protested. "Come on, let's get home already." Sasuke growled, attempting to haul her brother behind her. In so doing, she missed the melancholy look of longing he gave her. 2 weeks later. A large ball of flames roared over the pond, the heat causing the water to be pushed outwards beneath the fireball. Slowly the gout of fire began to reduce, dispersing into wisps of flames and revealing a slightly tired Naruto standing on the bridge breathing deeply. There were a few burn marks around his face, but it didn't stop him from breaking out into a wide grin. He had finally completed his family's rite of passage and mastered the great fireball jutsu. Behind him, his grandfather clapped softly at the achievement. When Naruto turned to look at him, he saw that Madara was giving him a smile. "Very good, Naruto, you're finally in full uchiha. Now come, I think it's time you finally learn why I have been taking your blood recently," said Madara. He turned to begin walking back across the cave. Naruto hurried to follow his grandfather. He was filled with excitement about finally getting an answer to his questions about the mysterious blood drawing. The elder Uchiha led his grandson across the smooth floor of the cave and into a narrow tunnel. Naruto's head cocked to the side in confusion as they entered the tunnel. This is the way to the forge, he realized. Inside, shadows encroached them from all sides, threatening to swallow the narrow passage in darkness and only being kept at bay by the candles placed along the wall. A red glow emanated from the end of the tunnel and it seemed to grow hotter and hotter the farther in they got. The forge was the place where they made their own weapons and tools, including kunai and shuriken. Every weapon they made was of better quality than the average weapon in a shinobi store, especially the mass-produced kunai and shuriken most ninja bought. When they entered the forge, a set of steps lead up to the top of the furnace to give easier access to place materials inside. At each corner of the room, large square holes had been burrowed into the rock, serving as chimneys up to the surface to carry the smoke and allow for a small amount of airflow. Looking around, Naruto immediately noticed the enormous pile of iron sand at the far end of the room, with a pile of charcoal opposite it. Propped against the wall were various tools for forging, including shovels, hammers, and tongs. Why was there so much? With that amount of sand, you could make hundreds of kunai. Turning to his grandfather in confusion, Naruto asked, "Why did you have a fire stoked for forging? What's it have to do with you drawing my blood?" In answer to the question, his grandfather made his way over to the wall across from the entrance, where light shone down from one of the chimneys. Pinned on the wall was a large sheet of paper with calculations and diagrams scrolled across its large face in tiny script. "Calculations, for a sword. This is the reason I have been drawing blood from you. You see, there are many different ways that the magnet release can be used, from the metal dust manipulation method used by your granduncle and the Yondaime Kazukiage to the weapon manipulation your grandmother preferred." Madara motioned for Naruto to come closer. Moving over to examine the blueprints, Naruto said, "I still don't get what that has to do with my blood, or even that sword." The moment he was in range, he received a bonk on the head from his grandfather, who muttered about impatience. Naruto rubbed his head gingerly. "I was just about to explain that. I believe your method was revealed when you killed those root agents. You instinctually turned the weapons into shards of metal. Now if you were to continue this you would need to carry around weapons and seals, like your grandmother, expending time and energy to release them and then turn them into shards, and that is where this sword comes in," said Madara. He motioned to the schematics on the wall. "Using my abilities, we will create a blade that shall only work for you, one with your blood and Jitan chakra imbued into it and sealed into every fold." His grandfather went on to explain the process in detail, including the mechanics. Naruto paid rapt attention, growing more and more excited every second. Finally, after every detail was explained, Madara turned to the tools, handing a shovel to Naruto while selecting one for himself. "We'll begin making the Tamahagane immediately," stated the former clan head as he began to shovel iron sand into the furnace. Soon, charcoal followed it as the smelting process began. 10 minutes later, the two Uchihas stood near the entrance sweating. His grandfather wiped his brow after making 3 wood clones to tend the smelting process before turning to him. "My clones can do most of the work, but I want you to help on weekends to make the blade." The smelting process of the Tamahagane would take about 3 days and the fire would need to be tended constantly. Every 10 minutes, another shovel of sand would be tossed in. From there, it would take another 4 to 6 months to forge the actual blade. Naruto couldn't help but feel a shiver of excitement shoot through him. He knew this blade would be something special and he couldn't wait to see it finished. Chapter end. Chapter 4. Massacre, Blood on the Leaves. A strong aroma of tomatoes permeated the air in the Uchiha household as Sasuke and Itachi entered their home. The smell crept into Sasuke's nose, causing a wide grin to break out on her face and her mouth to begin watering. She followed her nose towards the source, her nose being beckoned by the enticing scent. It was unmistakable, the smell of her mother fresh baked tomato bread. "It seems mother's made your favorite tonight," commented Itachi at her side. She only nodded her head vacantly. Right now, Sasuke's senses were focused solely on the heavenly aroma of her mother's cooking. The siblings entered the kitchen and were greeted by the sight of their mother putting the finishing touches on their dinner. When she heard them, Mikoto turned to the two with a smile, which Sasuke returned with a wide grin. "Welcome home you two. You arrived just in time. Go ahead and sit down, I'll have dinner ready in just a minute," greeted Mikoto. "Sure thing mom," replied Sasuke. She marched towards the table to sit down and wait for her meal. So absorbed in thoughts of the meal was she that she missed how Itachi's demeanor had changed when he entered the room their mother was in. The elder Uchiha's face had returned to its usually stoic mask, and though he offered a small and a nod to their mother, there was a tension in the air as they looked at each other. For a moment an unreadable emotion flickered across Mikoto's face before the tension was broken by Sasuke calling out from the table. "Hey Itachi, are you going to come sit down or what?" asked the impatient 8-year-old. Sasuke huffed. Was she the only one that couldn't wait for dinner? Itachi was in Anbu, he should be even more famished than her. "I'll be right there," she heard Itachi call. And just like that things were back to normal as both Uchiha children sat down at the table. The meal was soon laid out and the three were gathered together around the low rectangular table with their legs folded in front of them. Sasuke looked around in confusion for a moment. She only just noticed the absence of her father. "Hey mother, where's father?" Mikoto gave a tight smile, looking sadly at her. Sasuke's heart sunk. She knew what was going to be said before it was even said. "Sorry, but he won't be able to make it. He had to go on a mission for the clan at the last minute," answered her mother. There was an awkward moment of silence after the statement. This had been happening a lot lately and Sasuke noticed it often put a damper on meals. "So, how were your days?" asked Mikoto as she began to ladle out the food onto their plates. "Did you have any trouble in Anbu or the academy?" Itachi took a sip of tea before he answered. "My day was fine. It was just a simple patrol." "And what about yours, Sasuke?" The girl took a moment to register the question. She had just been in the middle of inhaling her first piece of tomato bread. She took a moment to gulp the tasty morsel down and replied, "Oh, it was normal, just some target practice and ninjutsu theory." She was going to go back to her dinner when Itachi spoke again, a hint of teasing in his tone. "What, not going to mention your new crush?" Sasuke began to blush and she leveled a glare at her brother. Hopefully her mom would ignore it. She groaned when she saw her mother quirk an eyebrow. "New crush?" She turned to her in curiosity, a strange gleam entering her eyes. For some reason that she couldn't quite place, Sasuke felt a shiver of fear at the look in her mother's eyes. It was almost hungry. "My little Suki has a crush. Who is it? What's he like?" The Uchiha mother's plate lay forgotten. Sasuke had her full attention, much to her chagrin. Sasuke huffed. "Don't call me that mom. I'm a kunoichi in training, I can't have cute nicknames." She'd been trying to get her mother to drop that nickname ever since she had begun that year at the academy. No such luck. "Not a chance young lady, and don't change the subject, spill." Mikoto looked at her daughter expectantly, drawing a growl from the young girl. "There's nothing to tell, I don't have a crush." The little ravenet directed a withering glare at Itachi, who was eating his food with an innocent expression. "Like I told big brother, it's not a crush. I just saw a boy in class do something weird today." "Oh, so just something weird. Why won't you tell me what happened then?" asked Mikoto with a giggle. Obviously she didn't quite believe her. Sasuke groaned in annoyance. First her brother and now her mother. Not her too. "Why won't anyone believe me that I don't have a crush?" "Fine, if you have to know." Sasuke relented as she explained to her mother how she had stayed back to practice and overheard the boys making fun of him. After she had mentioned the fact that she was certain he had hit 3 perfect bull's eyes with ease when he thought no one was watching, Mikoto actually seemed intrigued. 3 perfect bull's eyes. All at once. Mikoto's eyebrows rose as she saw her daughter nod. "See? I told you it was weird." Mikoto gave her daughter a placating smile before turning back to her food. Both her children did the same. Just as Sasuke had torn into another piece of tomato bread, she said something that made Sasuke choke on her bread. "So if you don't have a crush on the boy, how come this isn't the first time you've mentioned him?" "Mother." The streets of Konoha passed by swiftly beneath Itachi. A chill filled the mid-November air, but it didn't bother him. He had been trained not to be bothered by such little things as a slight chill. Despite the chill, the sun still shone down pleasantly and the inhabitants of the village went happily about their lives. Just a normal, happy day within the village. It was the exact opposite of how Itachi himself was feeling. His now impending mission to squash the coup of his clan was bringing a great deal of stress and guilt to the young Anbu. He needed a distraction from it, which was why he was now headed towards the academy. Sasuke's observation yesterday had given him the perfect excuse to focus on something else for a bit before he had to begin planning his mission. At first, he had simply thought that it was interesting that the Jinchuriki was more intelligent than he seemed. But after thinking on it, he had realized that what she had said yesterday warranted looking into. If it were any other child, he might have ignored it. But it wasn't. For some reason the Kikbi Jinchuriki had hidden his skills from everyone and put on such a good acting job that it had fooled everyone. The most disturbing part was the description of Naruto's switch in personality. It reminded him eerily of the followers of a certain warhawk. An image flashed through his mind of a Sharingan in the shape of a four-pointed shuriken. A rare shiver passed down his back. Shisui, if he's managed to gain control of him using Shisui's eye, then Lord Hokage needs to know. But the burst of speed Itachi continued forward. Only a few minutes later he alighted upon the rooftop of the building across from Naruto's apartment. Without a sound he settled himself into a crouch to prepare to stake out the young Jinchuriki. Dark gray clouds roiled over Konoha. A heavy rain spilled from them, drenching the village. All over water was running from gutters and drains, creating a constant sound of rushing water to accompany the sound of heavy raindrops falling like pellets on the ground. A flash of lightning raced across the sky, with a crash of thunder chasing behind it. Itachi Uchiha found himself crouched on top of a roof as the rain poured down on him without pause. Currently the only thing keeping him from being freezing cold was the fire chakra he was circulated throughout his body. His clothes clung heavily to his frame due to how soaked they were. The rain created a constant and almost deafening pitter-patter on the roof around him, though he didn't pay it any mind. His sole focus was the square of light on the side of the building that marked Naruto's apartment. So far, he hadn't seen a single thing out of the ordinary since he began his surveillance. Naruto appeared to be just as all the reports he had read said he was. The loud child who wished for attention in any way he could get it, who did poorly in every class he had despite trying hard, and an obsession for ramen. The window he was staring at showed a view of the front room of Naruto's apartment, in particular, the front door. If the blonde were to attempt to leave, he would know. Not for the first time Itachi found himself wondering whether he was wasting his time observing the blonde. It's been nearly a week now. With a sigh, Itachi took his eyes off the window for a moment as he considered his options. I need to begin planning for my mission. If I don't see anything today, I'm going to give this up. The young Anbu member almost scoffed at the idea of finding anything that day. With the weather, it was unlikely Naruto would go anywhere. Itachi's gaze flicked back onto the window. It was a good thing that he did. At the exact moment the Uchiha prodigy returned his focus to the window, a shadow flitted across the wall of the apartment. Naruto himself walked into view of the window a second later and proceeded to leave the apartment, locking the front door behind him. He's actually going somewhere in this weather? Itachi thought in puzzlement. He waited patiently for Naruto to appear at the street entrance to the apartment. The only problem was that he didn't. At first he simply thought that Naruto was simply taking a long time to walk down the stairs, but when seconds stretched into minutes and when minutes became a quarter of an hour, Itachi realized something was wrong. Swish. Itachi disappeared in a swirl of leaves. He reappeared a moment later at the entrance to Naruto's apartment complex and looked around himself carefully. Itachi sent chakra to his eyes. The black pools bled into the scarlet of the Sharingan as he went on alert for anything amiss. Itachi had his ears pricked for any strange sounds, blocking out the strangely soothing sounds of heavy rain pitter-pattering on roof of the quiet apartment building. Occasionally a flash of lightning would add to the flickering light quality of the chilly open hallways, soon to be followed by a crash of thunder. For a while his search turned up nothing. The hallways were empty, all the occupants preferring to stay inside and out of the dreadful weather. It wasn't until he began to descend the stairs to the laundry room that Itachi found something. Chuka chuka. The sound of one of the machines running reverberated off of the cold grey concrete walls of the room. Overhead a single dull yellow light flickered, providing a dim wavering light to see. Despite the poor light quality Itachi's eyes immediately picked up on something off about the room. But he couldn't place his finger on it. Itachi made his way cautiously into the room. His finely tuned senses from being an Anbu told him there was more to this room than met the eye. The Uchiha prodigy examined the room from top to bottom. Yet he found nothing. There seems to be nothing here, better move on. He still couldn't shake that feeling, like an annoying hum in the back of his mind. Boosh. The Anbu member stiffened when a small gust of air hit his exposed toes from below. He looked down and began to stare intently at the section of the floor he was standing on. His enhanced vision allowed him to see faint lines etched into the stone floor. The secret entrance. Itachi crouched down beside the small section of floor and began to inspect it. Upon closer examination, he found a small string of ninja wire, presumably to lift the section. I've seen this before, but where? With the wire in his grasp, Itachi began to weigh his options. There was a chance it was booby-trapped, but he was also certain this was where Naruto had disappeared to. If he wanted to find out what the young Jinchuriki was hiding, he would have to follow him. In the end, there really was no choice. He had committed himself to unraveling the puzzle of Naruto Uzumaki, so he had to follow. Itachi unconsciously held his breath as he gave a gentle tug to the wire. The stone lid parted smoothly with the floor, landing on the ground with a dull slap. For a tense moment, Itachi waited for an explosion to go off or for a plume of poisonous gas to erupt. But there was nothing. Just a dark gaping pit with a small adder disappearing into the darkness. Well, there's no time like the present. With a steadying breath to calm his nerves, Itachi began to descend into the darkness. "Grandfather, I'm home." Naruto's excited voice echoed throughout the hidden grotto in which he and his grandfather made their home. In the background, the distant ringing of metal on metal could be heard from the clones of his grandfather working on his sword. Naruto heard inside the simple two-story house. The next moment the door slid open to reveal his smiling grandfather leaning on his cane. A happy grin spread across Naruto's face as he raced to meet his grandfather, tackling the ancient Uchiha around the middle in a hug. Oof, Madara chuckled good-naturedly as the Naruto tackled him around the middle. The small black and blonde-haired boy felt his grandfather's arms envelope him in a warm hug. "It's good to see you too. Tell me, why didn't you come back last night?" asked Madara as they separated. Naruto chuckled nervously. He felt his face heat up slightly in embarrassment. Sorry grandfather. I overdid the physical training yesterday. I was too tired to make it through the tunnel," he explained. Although Naruto preferred to make it to the grotto as much as possible, sometimes he had to stay back, either to protect the secret or because he was too tired. The grotto had become his true home, it was the first place he had family. The young Uchiha pouted when his grandfather chuckled in amusement at his embarrassment, only furthering it when he ruffled his hair. "Go ahead and make a few clones to help with making the blade. Today you'll be working on chakra control." Naruto groaned. Shape transformation and chakra control were hard. Because of the size of his reserves, he had trouble with those subjects. He was about to complain when bonk. Ouch. Naruto winced and rubbed his head. His grandfather had whacked him on the head with his cane again. When he finally stopped rubbing the smarting lump, he shot a dirty look at his grandfather, which was met with a stern glare. "Don't give me that look, Naruto. Your reserves have been increasing once more, so you need to improve your control even further. You are an Uchiha, control and jutsu come naturally, but you must still work to attain them, especially with your Uzumaki genes." Naruto withered under the stern lecture. He knew his grandfather was right. With a sigh, he placed his hands in a cross-shaped seal and began to build his chakra. Poof. All around the cave smoke erupted in thick white plumes. There was so much it seemed like one solid cloud, almost the same size as that issued after a large summoning. After a few moments the smoke began to recede into wispy tendrils, revealing dozens of Narutos across the cavern. "You know the drill, 20 to each exercise." Naruto instructed them in a flat tone, resigned to the tedious training. Oh, how he wished he would be learning a cool jutsu today. With a sigh, Naruto turned towards the house. "I suppose I'll go see if I can get the fox to talk to me." Without waiting for a reply he walked into the house, intent on meeting his tenant. Had he looked at his grandfather, he would have seen the sudden narrowing of his eyes as he sensed something that Naruto couldn't. "Yes, that's a good idea," he replied idly. Naruto sat in a lotus position in his room. His breathing was carefully regulated. Slowly, all sound bled away. The world around him ceased to exist as he willed himself to appear inside his seal. Drip. 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 He opened his eyes to the familiar side of the physical representation of his seal. Up ahead he could see the entrance to the room that housed the Kikbi. Wordlessly he got to his feet and began to walk towards it. The wet slap of his sandals on the water reverberated off the narrow halls. "Grrr, I see you're back again, foolish human." "Yes, I figured I'd come see how you're doing. You must get lonely in here. I figured maybe you'd finally want to talk." The fox snorted in derision at the blonde statement. Behind the bars of its cage, its head lay on its crossed arms, the picture of boredom. "You expect me, the mighty Kikbi, to lower myself to speak to a human to pass the time? Worse yet, an Uchiha, the grandson of that bastard Madara." The fox growled. Naruto didn't react to the insulting words. Instead he opted to sit down on the water calmly and simply look at the Kikbi. "Well, I figured that it's better than just being alone in here." The Kikbi didn't answer, it simply closed its eyes and tried to sleep. Naruto tried to engage the fox in conversation, telling it about his day, his training, what he was planning on having for dinner. He got no reply. It stubbornly stuck to its declaration of not speaking to him. Naruto found himself having to resist sighing in frustration at the fox's continued stubbornness. "Perhaps I should try a different approach. We should at least come to some sort of agreement." Like it or not, we're stuck together and the man that removed you from my mother is still out there. He will come for you again. We'll need to work together to be able to stop him because this time, he won't simply let you get sealed. As soon as the last sentence had left his mouth, the room became bathed in the Kikbi's killing intent. The mighty beast shot to its feet and fixed Naruto with a deadly glare. A snarl ripped from its muzzle. A shiver of fear shot down the Uchiha's back and his breath caught in his lungs. Adrenaline began to flow through his body as the primal fear the beast's rage invoked triggered his fight-or-flight response. You think I need you, boy? I don't. If that man comes for me again I will tear through this seal and crush you beneath my heel, then I will find a way to rip that monkey eye from his skull and obliterate him. Slowly the killing intent disappeared and the Kikbi lay back down to sleep. It took a moment for the adrenaline to settle down in Naruto, but when it did, he gave a weary sigh. It seemed that he had messed up. Knowing that there wasn't anything else he could do that day, he began to walk towards the exit. In the silence that followed the Kikbi's rage, the splash of his sandals filled the entire room. He had almost reached the door before he paused and spoke to the fox without looking back. You know, we don't have to be enemies. Like I said earlier, we're stuck together. We should make the most of it. He wasn't expecting a reply. Thus, he was surprised the fox's voice from behind him made him pause. Kikbi had cracked an eye open to stare at the blonde's back in puzzlement. Why do you try so hard to get me to speak with you, boy? Do you not hate me? After all, I was the one that killed your parents. Naruto stopped his exit, glancing over his shoulder at Kikbi. Perhaps he did have a chance to make progress. No, I don't hate you. You were simply trying to avoid being locked up again, I probably would have done the same in your position. The Kikbi seemed stunned by his answer, though it was shocked even more by what followed after. As for why I try hard to get you to speak to me, it's because I know how you've been treated in the past. You've been hated and hating in return for so long that hate has become all you know. I want to change that. But that last declaration, Naruto pivoted on his heel and began to walk towards the entrance once more. He had just reached the archway that led into the darkened corridor when the Kikbi spoke from behind him. You're a fool, Naruto. The blonde Uchiha couldn't help the grin that stretched his chubby face. He had finally made progress. Itachi stared at the scene in the cavern with surprise. When he had followed the blonde's secret tunnel, he had expected to discover something about the blonde. He had half expected it to lead to the root facility. But it didn't. There was an old man with a cane alright, but it wasn't Dansma. This old man looked even older than him or the Hokage, almost like a living mummy. His thin white hair cascaded down the front of the simple black robe he wore, framing sharp black eyes that he could swear were looking at him. The truly shocking part was the troop of Narutos all around him. Although these ones wore the same clothes, they were different than the blonde he was used to. They had strands of black in their hair and were taller and more muscular than the blonde. All of them were performing remarkably advanced exercises. He does have a secret teacher. Itachi gazed intently at the old man while trying to stay undetectable. Do I risk getting closer to learn more? He agonized over the decision, trying to pick between learning more and informing the Hokage. Unfortunately, the choice was taken out of his hands as the old man's voice, cracked with age, echoed across the cavern. You can come out now, I know you're there. The young Anbu froze, shock and confusion ruling his brain, and his heart skipped a beat. How had he been spotted? Was he sloppy, or was the old man just very good? Itachi considered turning and running, but his curiosity got the best of him. He stepped out of the tunnel and began to cautiously approach the old man. Around him, the clones looked at him in shock, fear, and confusion. The whispered hisses of their conversation seemed to follow him. Whereas the clones seemed confused, when he met the eyes of the old man, he seemed interested. A strange glint entered his eyes at the sight of the animal mask and pair of Sharingan eyes. Ah, one of the little monkey's personal shinobi. And an Uchiha no less. I suppose it was only a matter of time before one of you caught on. Far from appearing concerned, it was almost like the man had been expecting this. Not to mention the way the man noted him as being an Uchiha set Itachi on edge. Who are you? Why have you been training Naruto Uzumaki? Asked Itachi. He had exposed himself, so he might as well get some answers. Far from being intimidated by the serious tone Itachi held, the old man seemed too amused. Who am I? That's a difficult one to answer. You probably won't believe me. Answered the man. I'd like an answer nonetheless. The old man seemed to consider his demand. As you wish. I am a dead man. The man seemed to take pleasure in the frustration that was evident in the stiffening of Itachi's shoulders. At least, that is what people believe. You see, I am the founder of your clan in this village, I am Madara Uchiha. Itachi recoiled in shock at the statement. Madara. But what of the masked man? Had he been lying or was the old man lying? Itachi narrowed his eyes in suspicion behind the cat mask. You expect me to believe you are Madara? Even if I were to believe you, why would you be training Naruto? Believe it or not, it will not change the fact that I am. As for why I'm training Naruto, the answer is simple. Madara paused to activate his Sharingan. He is my grandson, and I wish for him to have the childhood I could not provide his father with. Itachi was stunned. No, he was beyond that, he couldn't even process what had been said. The words Madara, Naruto, and grandson kept repeating in his mind as he tried to come to terms with the earth-shattering statement. He was shaken from his shocked stupor by Madara's next words. Now, if you wish I will tell you all you need to know. In return, I would ask that you deliver a message to Sarutobi for me," said Madara. It took a moment for Itachi to consider the offer. Dare he take it? Really, he had nothing to lose. In the end, whether Madara was lying or he wasn't, he would still report it to the Hokage. He gave a sharp nod to the ancient uchiha, signaling his assent. Very well, Madara began to tell his story Itachi. For what seemed like hours they sat as he recounted of meeting his wife and having their son. Madara told him of the years he spent searching for his son and eventually finding him only to be too late. When the entire story was told, Itachi was left in contemplative silence. With a quick reassurance to Madara that he would remember to tell the Hokage of his wish to meet, Itachi left the cave with many thoughts on his mind. But now that he had finally solved the mystery of Naruto, there was only one at the forefront. It's time to begin the final preparation. My mission begins in 9 days. Chapter End. Chapter 5. The Fallout. Naruto begins. It was a surprisingly bright and sunny day in Konoha, considering the dark events of the past 48 hours. A slight breeze swept over Sarutobi. He stood on the rooftop of the Hokage Tower. His white and red robes provided protection from the winter chill. Far down below, in the schoolyard, the younger academy students were enjoying their lunch hour, running around and playing with each other, blissfully unaware of the tension in the village. It managed to bring a smile to his face, in spite of the terrible massacre of more than a day previous. Ah, innocence, it is truly a wonderful thing. Swish. Hiruzen didn't react to the sound of displaced wind and the rustling of cloth. I see you've finally decided to approach me, said Hiruzen, taking a drag on his pipe. I was beginning to wonder if you would work up the courage to reveal yourself, Itachi. Hiruzen finally turned around to see Itachi there kneeling before him with his head bowed penitently. His grey Anbu vest was stained with dried blood. The smell of rusted iron reached Hiruzen's nose. My mission is complete, Lord Third. The Uchiha coup has been suppressed, there will be no civil war. Itachi finally looked up at him. Though Itachi tried to hide it, Hiruzen could see the pain in his eyes. Hiruzen felt guilt gnaw at his stomach as he looked at the pain in Itachi's eyes. Pain he knew was due to the mission he had been forced to carry out by Dansm. His throat tightened from his sadness and a couple unshed tears shimmered in his eyes. I should have listened to Guy when he tried to tell me what being an Anbu could do to people like Kakashi and Itachi. The old Hokage closed his eyes and took a drag from his pipe. He forced down his emotions. Right now was not the time to wallow over past mistakes. Lord Hokage, I did not just come before you to report my mission a success. I also come bearing a request and important news. Hiruzen's eyebrows rose slightly. The request he could guess easy enough, but Itachi bringing news was unexpected. The request is about my sister, and the news is about Naruto Uzumaki. Curiosity turned to intense focus. Hiruzen looked at Itachi with a narrowed gaze. Very well, I'll hear your request first. Itachi surprised Hiruzen by bowing down before him, with his forehead touching the ground. Please, Lord Hokage, look after and protect Sasuke and ensure she doesn't learn the truth of what happened that night. I fear that she might turn on the village and get herself killed, pleaded Itachi, giving a rare show of emotion. Hiruzen nodded. That was easy enough, considering what Itachi had given up. It touched him that the boy cared for only his sister in such a time of pain. Please, Itachi, stand up. You do not need to bow to me. Itachi raised his head, his onyx black eyes looking into the sympathetic eyes of the Hokage. Slowly, he got to his feet, drawing a small sad smile from the Hokage. You have my word, Sasuke will be safe. She will not know of what occurred. Hiruzen crossed the short distance between him and Itachi and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. He looked up at the boy with his sad smile. I do not like of the manner in which you did it, but thank you for protecting this village from civil war. The barrier formula will remain the same in case you ever wish to check in on her. Thank you, Lord Hokage, said Itachi sincerely. They stood there for a moment before finally Sarutobi cleared his throat and donned a serious look. You don't need to thank me. Nothing I do could ever repay you for the sacrifice you've made. Now, what is this important news about Naruto? Surprisingly, Itachi didn't answer immediately. Instead he shifted nervously, as if he was trying to decide how to begin. After a few moments he finally seemed to be ready to speak. 2 weeks ago my sister noticed him do something odd, for him at least. She saw him get 3 bull's eyes at the same time while he thought no one was around. Apparently his entire demeanor changed. He was much calmer, much colder, Itachi said. Hiruzen struggled not to show his shock. That description caused him to think of his old rival, more specifically, his root operatives. He clenched his fist when he imagined Naruto being controlled by Dansme. No, can't jump to conclusions. It seemed Itachi was aware of the direction his thoughts were heading, as he was quick to ease his worries. This change has nothing to do with root, well, at least not directly. Hiruzen narrowed his eyes at the young man. Although he felt bad for what Itachi had gone through, he had no time for beating around the bush. In many ways Naruto was like his grandson. If Naruto was in danger, he needed to know. Explain. He ordered Itachi. The young man quickly followed his orders, summarizing what he had witnessed during his week following Naruto. After I followed him through the tunnel, I came upon a cavern. It was there I encountered his mentor. His mentor is Madara Uchiha. Hiruzen's eyes bulged in shock and his blood ran cold. He struggled to draw breath for a moment, it was like he had forgotten how to breathe. His mind instantly began to try to deny Itachi's statement. No, it's not possible. He died long ago. Surely it couldn't be, but he knew that wasn't true. Living as long as he had, he knew that nothing was truly impossible. Still, even assuming he was still alive, why would Madara choose to train Naruto? Was it for the Kikbi? Are you certain that he is Madara? Asked Hiruzen. He was almost begging for any hope of refuting the claim. Itachi fixed him with an extremely serious stare and gave a resolute nod. A shiver of dread traveled down his spine. Madara Uchiha was living underneath the village. It reminded him of tales told of monsters lurking just out of sight, waiting to strike. You knew that he was living within this village and you waited until now to tell me? His asked accusingly. The idea of Madara being in the village terrified him. Itachi flinched, but he didn't back down. There were reasons, one being that my movements were being watched by Dansme. If I had tried to contact you, then he would have carried out the massacre himself and Sasuke would be dead, defended Itachi. Hiruzen's eyes softened slightly. Itachi would truly do anything for his sister, even put the village he loved at risk. However, Hiruzen's gaze sharpened. The main reason that I waited was because I do not think Madara is a threat to Naruto or the village, said Itachi. Hiruzen stared at him incredulously, as if he had grown a second head. Not a threat? I suppose you gathered this simply by observing him? Asked Hiruzen, his eyes were narrowed in suspicion. Itachi gulped audibly. No, he discovered me and introduced himself, he admitted. Itachi took a deep breath before he continued. He told me that he was Naruto's grandfather on his father's side. Time seemed to stop for Hiruzen. His mind almost had to reboot as he processed the shocking statement. Madara Uchiha, Naruto's grandfather. It's ridiculous and yet, it isn't entirely unlikely. He tried to regain his composure, but his reaction had been quite obvious and he was obviously still shaken. Do you believe him? He waited with bated breath for the boy's answer. I do. Itachi said confidently. There was no hesitation at all. That caught Hiruzen unawares. To make such a statement that calmly, surely he had seen proof. Tell me everything, commanded Hiruzen. It was all he needed to say. Itachi began to tell him about his conversation with Madara, what he had seen of Naruto training, and what he had learned of the history of Naruto's father. Hiruzen had to grudgingly admit that Madara's story filled in a lot of the mystery surrounding his student's finding of Minato. Finally, Itachi told him of his reasons for believing him. I believe him for three main reasons. First, is a picture of Madara and a woman with a baby, the woman greatly resembled Naruto, and the fourth. The second is the fact that all of his clones had the Sharingan. It lends credence to the claim of him having Uchiha heritage, explained Itachi. His tone was calm, as if he was only giving a report. By now, Hiruzen had relaxed slightly, although he was still not convinced. And the final reason? He asked tensely. That is the most compelling, Lord Hokage. You see, I was able to look at his chakra with my Sharingan. As you know, it allows me to differentiate chakra signatures. Madara's was by far the most potent and powerful I have ever seen. It was terrifying how far above everyone else's it was, but here Itachi looked directly into Hiruzen's eyes. The elder shinobi could tell he was trying to convey the utter surety of his next words. It did not contain the look of darkness about it that all of our clan suffering from the curse of hatred possess. Itachi had one more comment, one that did a lot to ease Hiruzen's anxiety and also made him curious. I believe that he has no negative intentions towards Naruto or the village. He is simply a grandfather who wishes to provide all that he can for his grandson. I would think you could relate, said Itachi. There was the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. That alone set Hiruzen at ease. Itachi was absolutely certain of his assumptions and he had absolute faith in Itachi. Itachi is not easily fooled, especially not his eyes. If what he says is true, Madara has reformed. Hiruzen didn't show any outward reaction. His face remained in a blank mask. He turned and faced the village once more. Looking out at the place he had pledged his life to protect and hearing the children learning in the academy yards below, he came to a decision. Very well. Inform Madara that I will agree to meet him in 1 day's time in my office. Once again, I thank you for what you have sacrificed. Now I would suggest you leave, there are Anbu still looking for you. As you wish, Lord Hokage, said Itachi. With a swish of cloth and a rustle of leaves, he disappeared just as soon as he came. Hiruzen was left alone on the rooftop, lost in his thoughts of Naruto and the new revelations. Naruto could feel the creeping winter chill trying to seep through his skin. A blanket of uniform gray cloud stretched across the sky of Konoha that day. It threw a muted light down on the village, draining it of all its color and making his bright orange short-sleeved hoodie stand out all the more. Naruto stood with the rest of his class around the Taijutsu ring, waiting to spar. For once he found himself glad for the distraction the Taijutsu brought him. He wouldn't be able to focus on anything but hiding his skills. The less he was able to think about his grandfather's upcoming meeting with the Hokage, the better. I hope everything goes okay, I don't want to be alone again. Naruto's stomach dropped at the thought of no longer having his grandfather. When he had been alone the first time, he had no idea what it was like to have a family. To lose it now after he had only just found it a short time ago would be heartbreaking. Speaking of losing family, Naruto looked in sympathy at the silent brooding figure of Sasuke. Poor Sasuke. Losing everyone in one night must be horrible. I can't believe she's back in school already, it's only been 2 days. He was stopped from further thinking about the raven-haired girl by the sound of Iruka's voice. Good effort, Shinichi, Kazu. Although, Shinichi, you should have focused more on outmaneuvering Kazu instead of overpowering him. Remember, a shinobi needs to be both strong and cunning, said Iruka as 2 boys exited the ring. The smaller of the 2 hung his head as he walked back into the crowd with a busted lip. Iruka looked down to consult his clipboard where the names of the people sparring against each other were prepared beforehand. Alright, next is Hinata against Naruto, both of you step into the ring. Naruto stepped into the ring to face his opponent. As usual, Hinata was acting extremely shy. She looked at him while poking her fingers together, something he had come to recognize as a defensive tic of hers. Hinata offered him a stuttering good luck, which he returned with a gruff one of his own. Make the seal of confrontation, you two, commanded Iruka. The 2 children held their hands up in a half-ram seal, preparing to begin their match. Go. Immediately the 2 sprang into action, well at least Naruto did. He charged forward, with his fist cocked back. Hinata didn't move forward, she simply waited to gently slap his hand away. But that was all. Naruto's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. He had been wide open after that counter. With the Hika's gentle fist, Hinata should have been able to end the match right there. Does she not know that style? Naruto mentally scoffed at that thought. Of course she knew the style, she was heiress to the clan after all. So why is she going easy on me? Naruto used the momentum from his countered blow to spin into a low sweep kick, which Hinata simply jumped over. Once again, Naruto was surprised when she failed to capitalize. When he got back to his feet, Hinata began to barrage him with some weak strikes that he let hit while he clumsily attempted to defend them. It confused him that none of them hurt like he expected, they hurt no more than light jabs. What's going on? I know the Hika style is much more powerful than this. Naruto let loose a fierce yell of effort as he launched another barrage of punches. To his confusion and secretly frustration, Hinata once again simply gently countered the hard blows. I know it's called the gentle fist, but this is just ridiculous. And the pattern continued. He would attack and she would passively defend, or she would launch half-hearted offense. It was really beginning to get on his nerves. His usual modus operandi was to come out swinging and then let his opponent overtake him by either speed or skill. But the Hinata was avoiding any serious strikes and didn't attempt to end it during the numerous openings he gave her. She's making this really hard to lose. Finally, the last straw came after a slightly more intense barrage of blows from Hinata. As if on instinct, she began to move in for a debilitating strike that would have undoubtedly ended the match. At the last moment, she utterly flinched and pulled back her arm, causing her to stumble. Naruto's eyes narrowed to slits. That's it, I'm through with this. She hasn't even been using any chakra for her strikes. Maintaining his usual level of speed, Naruto took advantage of Hinata's stumble by sweeping her legs out from under her, causing her to fall with a surprised yelp. Naruto knelt beside her and made as if to punch her. Hinata's eyes clenched shut in anticipation for the blow. His knuckles came to a swift and violent stop a mere centimeter from her nose. Utter silence surrounded the two. Winner Naruto, declared Iruka. He, like everyone else, seemed surprised by Naruto's upset victory. Hinata, who had kept her eyes closed, opened her eyes in surprise. A blush overtook her face. It looks like you win, and Naruto, she said meekly. Naruto struggled not to scowl. He had only won because she refused to fight. Even to his regular persona, that wasn't a win worth having. Nevertheless, he gave her a small grin and pulled her to her feet. He stuck out his pointer and index finger to her, offering the seal of reconciliation. With an even bigger blush than before, she accepted it with a trembling hand. "But you too, especially you Naruto," praised Iruka. Naruto gave him a wide grin and rubbed the back of his head sheepishly. "Yep, guess all my training is finally paying off," he replied. Hinata and Naruto walked out of the ring, rejoining the rest of the class. Around them, the students were muttering about his win, although most seemed to be under the impression it was because he was against one of the weaker members of the class. "It's not like that's anything to be proud of. He finally beat a girl, big deal." Naruto scowled at the mutters. He knew better than anyone that he shouldn't have won. Next to him Hinata poked her fingers together nervously. "You don't mind the men Naruto. I'm sure it was your tea training," said Hinata. She let out a surprised eep when Naruto turned his scowl at her. He wasn't angry at her for holding back, but rather for doing it to the extreme. She had to make sure she didn't hurt him. "That's not why I'm mad," he growled. "You weren't even trying. There were lots of chances for you to beat me. Would you go easy on me?" Hinata's eyes widened. Didn't WW want YYUT2G get H hurt? The Jage can see cause a lot. Naruto interrupted her. "So you just thought I wasn't tough enough to take it? Do you do that against everyone?" Hinata's flinch at his harsh words was his answer. "What if you hesitate like that in a real fight cause you don't want to hurt anyone? You'll get yourself, and maybe your teammates, killed." Her eyes shot wide in complete shock. The brunette's head drooped. I never thought of it like that," she said. "I'll try to stop H holding back." Naruto nodded silently, moving to take his place around the ring once more. "Alright, next up is Kiba and Sasuke," Iruka said. There was a slight hesitance in his voice when he reached Sasuke's name. The massacre was fresh in everyone's mind. Kiba and Sasuke entered the ring and faced off. Kiba, who was usually rather cocky, was actually rather subdued, although it didn't stop him from having a confident smile. Both of them made the seal of confrontation. "Go," said Iruka. Neither combatant made a move to begin fighting. Naruto was actually concerned about Sasuke. Usually she went into a fight with either a calm mask or a confident smirk. This time he could only see rage in her eyes. That look. I wonder if Kiba know what kind of trouble he's in. He better not start the fight like he usually does. Kiba was one of Sasuke's biggest admirers. He always started every spar between them with some sort of attempt to get her to agree to hang out with him. "Don't worry Sasuke, I'll take it easy on you. After all, you're going through a loss. It wouldn't be fair if I fought you at full strength when you're still dealing with what happened to your clan," said Kiba. He obviously was trying to appear sympathetic. But Naruto knew as soon as that sentence left his lips, he had said the wrong thing. He started to get a bad feeling. He was pretty sure he knew what was about to happen to Kiba. This feeling, she's beyond mad. Apparently Kiba wasn't as astute at sensing emotions. He seemed to think that Sasuke was shaking with sobs. "Hey, sorry, I didn't want it to make you cry, maybe I can." Kiba would never know what hit him. One second he was about to offer her a shoulder to cry on, the next, he was receiving a brutal kick to the side. He instantly doubled up, clutching his ribs. Sasuke didn't stop. She took advantage of his bent-over position and brought up a crushing knee into his face. There was a sort of wet crunch that made Naruto cringe. Kiba went down clutching his face. It was obvious from the blood gushing from beneath his hand that Sasuke had broke his nose. Despite the fact that Kiba was now on the ground in pain, Sasuke didn't let up. She straddled his chest and began to rain down blows on whatever part of him she could reach. Kiba was helpless to defend himself. Sasuke seemed deaf to Iruka's shouts that she had already won. Naruto looked on, slightly disturbed, as Iruka was forced to intercede and pull Sasuke off of Kiba. "I said that's enough. You've clearly won," Iruka said strictly. His eyes then softened slightly. "You're going through a tough time right now and it's obviously clouding your judgment. Why don't you go cool off?" Sasuke glared at Iruka for a moment with a look of pure hate. It was almost like she was seeing someone else instead of the kind Chunin teacher. In fact, Naruto was almost sure she was seeing someone else, someone she wanted to kill. Without a word she turned and stalked off, ignoring everyone muttering around her. Naruto stared after her in worry. Unlike Iruka, he wasn't so sure that her judgment was truly clouded, at least not in the sense that Iruka was thinking. The rage she had shown was unsettling. It went further than simply having your clan killed. "I know how hard it would be for me to lose just grandfather, what must it be like for her to lose all the friends and family she's ever known?" Naruto knew some of what happened that night. Itachi had stopped the clan before it could launch a coup. So much death. Women and children, and all because of a bunch of delusional fools. He hadn't known any of the clan, except for Sasuke, but he knew that many didn't deserve to die. Perhaps the worst casualty was Sasuke. Something had happened. That rage, that hate. There's more going on here. Itachi must have done something to her. Naruto stared at the Uchiha crest on Sasuke's back. It suddenly hit him. They were the only young Uchiha left now, even if Sasuke didn't know he was an Uchiha. In that moment, he made up his mind. They're outside that dirt ring, he made a promise that would affect both their futures. I don't know what's happened to you Sasuke, but I'll help you out of that hate, even if I can't do it directly for now. Night was beginning to fall in Konoha. Outside, the temperature had fallen drastically and storm clouds gathered. The howling wind and freezing rain battered the windows of the Hokage's office. The room was dark and he had chosen not to light any candles and Hiruzen was waiting in silent anticipation for his guest. He had already dismissed his Anbu guards, telling them that the meeting required the utmost secrecy. If the old man that Itachi had met was indeed Madara, then the Anbu would only get in the way if things got confrontational. Even if he was a decrepit old man, Madara was surely a fearsome foe. Although he was hoping that Itachi's assessment of the man was correct. Madara Uchiha, Naruto's grandfather. It's not completely beyond belief. There was always mystery surrounding the circumstances of Jiraiya finding Minato. When Jiraiya had gone back to find the body of the woman after he had secured Minato in nearby Tenzaku town he had found it gone. On top of this, all the bandits' bodies had been reduced to ashes. It was most unusual. Hiruzen tensed when a voice called out to him from the shadows. I see you've got your mind working, as usual. The voice was ancient and cracking, but it still held a deep tone. Instantly he was on his feet forcing his chair back as he did settling into a defensive stance. His heart beat wildly in his chest. And his eyes narrowed at the sight of the mummy-like old man stand calmly in front of his desk, leaning on an old kama as if it were a cane. That face. He's a lot older, but I'd never forget that face. Madara. Hiruzen didn't move from his defensive stance. He silently evaluated the Uchiha, puzzling over his surprise entrance. I'm no sensor type, but I can usually sense chakra decently at this range. Yet he managed to enter without me even sensing it. It suddenly dawned on him that if the Uchiha could enter so undetected, he could have killed him any time he wanted. And yet he didn't. Hiruzen slowly relaxed his stance. Madara offered him a lopsided smirk. A little jumpy there, little monkey. I imagine you're surprised to see me alive after so long. Without waiting for an invitation, Madara took a seat in one of the simple wooden chairs in front of the Hokage's desk. Hiruzen followed suit, retrieving his high-backed chair without taking his eyes off Madara. He felt a prick of irritation at his guest's apparent disregard of him. I will admit, it is a surprise, said Hiruzen. So, you wanted to meet me and convince me of the fact that you have Naruto's best interests at heart. Convince me. Ordered Hiruzen, in a tone that brokered no room for interpretation. If Madara failed to satisfyingly convince him, he wouldn't hesitate to fight him. If he was intimidated by the threat, Madara didn't show it, not that Hiruzen had expected him to. I assume that Itachi informed you of my family's history in the past 50 years. Hiruzen nodded. Madara seemed to notice the calculating gaze Hiruzen was giving him, as he said, and yet you are not satisfied. It wasn't a question but a statement. Nevertheless, Hiruzen answered with a nod. I suppose I could tell you the story, mused Madara. But it would be quicker to show you. Without warning, Madara's Sharingan spun to life, trapping Hiruzen in its illusion. Hiruzen cursed himself. How had he let Madara get the drop on him? The world blurred before his eyes, the world being shaded in red and black. Sweat began to bead to his brow. How do I get out of this? When Madara appeared before him in the strange red and black world, Hiruzen immediately moved to defend himself. Oh, relax. If I had wanted to hurt you, I would have used Tsukiyomi. As it is, this illusion could be broken with a simple flux of chakra. I've brought you here to show you my memories of my life since I left Konoha all those years ago. Explained Madara. Despite the Uchiha's reassurance, Hiruzen remained on guard. He was inside the illusion of one of the most dangerous shinobi in history after all. However, despite his reservations, he knew the Uchiha was right. He could have done much worse things than having them appear in an illusionary world together. An examination of his chakra network revealed this genjutsu was no more complicated than a demonic illusion. False surroundings. Hiruzen eyed Madara wearily. I suppose I can view these memories of yours. Whether I believe them or not I shall decide after I have viewed them, he said. The Uchiha inclined his head slightly. Madara turned his gaze to a wall beside them. Good. We shall start at the beginning, my fight at the Valley of the End. I warn you, there are some things I will keep hidden. Even I am entitled to my secrets. And so the two stood and watched Madara's life for the past 60 years. Throughout it, Madara would occasionally explain something. For the most part though, he simply let the memories do the talking. Hiruzen didn't say a word, content to watch and judge whether the memories were real. He was surprised when Madara began to have tears sliding down his face when they came to the day his wife died. Despite his reservations, he could sympathize with the man's agony. A half hour later, Madara cancelled the illusion after the final memory was played. Once more Hiruzen sat in his high-back chair. His body was stiff from sitting in the same position for so long. Absent-mindedly, he pulled out his pipe and lit it with a small fire jutsu. This certainly is a lot to take in. Hiruzen glanced at Madara, who was wiping away the trails of tears that had gathered during their viewing of the memories. So it wasn't just part of the illusion. Hiruzen contemplated the position he found himself in. His mind was a storm of thoughts, all coming together into complex patterns as he reconstructed the timeline of what had happened. It's answered a great many questions I've had over the years. There's no doubt that the memories he showed revealed the true events of what happened, but still, can I trust him? Hiruzen looked at the photo of the first Hokage on the wall. What would you do were you in my place, sensei? He nearly snorted at his own stupidity. Of course, you would say to give him a chance. And I suppose I should too. Finally he broke the silence that had stretched between them. I believe you have told me the truth here. So I will hear you out. Now, why did you wish to meet? Thankfully, Madara didn't insult him by pretending to be confused. They both knew that if he had wished to remain hidden, he would have simply killed Itachi when he stumbled upon his hidden home. Straight to the point then, said Madara. His expression was serious, but weary at the same time. He truly began to look like a dot until then, the fact hadn't quite dawned on him that Madara was very, very old. Older than himself by over 2 decades. I've noticed recently that my energy is leaving me. My time is drawing closer. Hiruzen's eyes widened in surprise and he made to speak, but Madara continued without letting him interrupt. I still have a number of years left, but I'd be lucky to live to see Naruto graduate the academy. For that reason, I wish to ensure that there is someone there for him that I can trust. Hiruzen looked at Madara shrewdly. He didn't seem like the type to trust easily. I see. What did you have in mind? Surely you don't plan on selecting a random person to help? Asked Hiruzen. He could tell Madara had something in mind and it involved something that only he could help him with. Madara shot him a sly smile. You might have Hashirama's kindness, but I see you've also inherited Tobirama's shrewdness, he complimented. As you must know, I have a plan. To complete it, I need 2 things from you. Hiruzen regarded Madara with a blank face, not revealing the activity going on inside his min. He was trying to anticipate what the Uchiha would ask for, but it was. And these things are. Madara's lips quirked into a lopsided grin. The first is a certain jutsu. As Madara began to lay out his plan, Hiruzen felt the urge to massage his temples. One thing was certain, it would take time to get the things necessary for Madara's plan, and they would be a pain. 6 months later. Naruto was practically quivering in anticipation. He hadn't changed much in the past 6 months, except for a little more black in his hair. The slap of his sandals on stone floor reverberated off the tunnel walls as he raced towards his hidden home in the cavern behind the waterfall. He had just gotten out of the academy and he was eager to get home. Why? Because today was the day. The day he finally got to see the finished form of the katana he had helped forge to help him use his magnet release. He hadn't seen the blade in over a month. Once it was forged, his grandfather had wanted to polish and furnish it with a guard and handle himself. Apparently he wanted it to be a surprise for Naruto. When he came bursting from the tunnel, he was greeted by the sight of his grandfather standing in front of the house, leaning on his cane. Naruto hastily slowed his pace. He blushed in embarrassment when his grandfather chuckled at his less than dignified entrance. Despite his embarrassment, Naruto's gaze was fixed on the long bundle of white cloth his grandfather held. Eager I see. Well, come, see your sword. Said Madara. He held out the cloth-wrapped bundle for Naruto to take. The bundle was about 3.5 feet in length and it was slightly curved. Naruto reached out and took proffered bundle with slightly trembling hands. Now that the moment was here, he was overcome with nervousness. The cloth felt soft and silky to the touch. Taking a breath, he gently moved aside the cloth to finally gaze upon the side of his sword. The elegant blade rested inside a plain white sheath. Its gleaming bronze guard was simple but elegant, taking the shape of 4-paned rectangle, similar to a window. Its long hilt was wrapped in a lavender cloth, revealing little diamonds of the rough sharkskin beneath. He grasped the clothed hilt in his hand and paused for a moment. Anticipation washed over him, he was finally going to unsheath his sword. With a sharp firm tug, he removed the blade. The sword slid smoothly out of the sheath, revealing the razor-sharp blade within. It glinted in the soft torchlight of the cavern. It was beautiful, breathtaking. Naruto was surprised to feel tears begin to prick his eyes. It finally hit him just what he was holding. This was the culmination of half a year's work with his grandfather, a symbol of how much he cared for him. Naruto struggled to find some way to express how grateful he was to his grandfather. Not just for the blade, but for finding him and being in his life. In a voice choked with emotion, he said, "Thank you, grandfather." Madara smiled at his grandson softly. There's no need to thank me, Naruto. If anything it's I that should thank you. You've given me a reason to continue on. If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened to me when your father died, said Madara with utter sincerity. Naruto's eyes widened at his grandfather's words, it wasn't often that he expressed his emotions like that. Now, would you like to know the blade's name? Naruto nodded eagerly, still not trusting his voice. I call it Senbonsakura. Use it well, said Madara. Naruto nodded mutely. His gaze was locked on the blade that had been forged using his chakra and blood. He almost felt like the blade was emitting a protective and comforting feeling to him. As he felt that comforting presence, his mind turned to another young Uchiha in another part of the village, who was all alone. Sasuke, you've been so different since the massacre. He felt a wave of loathing for the foolish members of the clan who had tried to overthrow the village. It was because of them that so many innocent lives were lost and Sasuke became the cold individual she was. At that moment, he made a pledge. I'll use this sword to protect our clan and our village. And I'll also help you regain that kind smile you once had, even if I can't do it directly right now. The Uchiha clan will rise again. Later that night, a lone figure stood outside the Uchiha family's house. Madara stood in the middle of the training ground. The flickering torchlight lit it in a soft yellow glow. He had put Naruto to bed an hour ago, and now that the younger Uchiha was sleeping peacefully, he was ready to enact the plan that he had been making for the past 6 months. It had taken a lot of convincing to get Hiruzen to hand over the jutsu he needed, and even longer to get the thing he needed, a sample of blood. Madara channeled his chakra and began to form hand seals. Tora, Mi, Inu, Tatsu. Madara clapped his hands together and unleashed his chakra, whispering, summoning. Impure world reincarnation. Sweat beaded Madara's brow from the strain of the jutsu. A void formed in the ground, glowing with an intense purple light. From within, a coffin began to emerge, rising up to face Madara. When the coffin was fully emerged, intense purple light began to fade. All was silent in the cavern. Madara admired his handiwork. It had taken a long time to get it ready, his only regret was that he couldn't return either of Naruto's parents to him. Madara sent chakra to his eyes, activating the eternal Manjukum Sharingan. The 3 elongated Tomo, with the circles at their ends and bars on the outside, began to spin. A ripple pulsed outwards from his pupil, unleashing concentric black rings that left a light grayish purple in their wake, spreading across the entire sclera and irides. An eerie creak filled the cavern as the lid toppled forth, hitting the stone floor with a reverberating clack. Madara looked into the brown eyes of the coffin's occupant, which were looking around in shock. Greetings. My name is Madara Uchiha, and I have a proposition for you. Chapter end. What if Naruto has harem in the Uchiha clan? And thanks for watching my video till the end. If you enjoy this content, then do consider subscribing to my channel and leave a like if you guys need the next part, comment down, and thanks for watching the video and see you guys in the next video.